Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. April had just turned cold again when I got the call about the house. My childhood home in Millbridge, Vermont, had been sitting empty for 18 months since Dad passed, and the lawyer said it was time to either sell or commit to the property taxes. I'd been avoiding it, honestly. The place held too many memories, and not all of them were the kind you want to revisit. But my apartment lease in Boston was ending, and I figured 2 weeks in Vermont wouldn't kill me. I could sort through decades of accumulated stuff, get the house ready for listing, and maybe find some closure. The drive up through New Hampshire felt longer than I remembered. The mountains pressing in on both sides of the highway, still patched with dirty snow even though it was late March. Millbridge hadn't changed much. Population 3,200, one stoplight, 3 churches, and a general store that doubled as the post office. The kind of place where everyone knows your business before you do. The house looked smaller than it did in my memories. The white paint had gone gray in patches, and the apple orchard behind the property had grown wild, branches tangled together like arthritic fingers reaching toward the sky. Dad had stopped maintaining it after Mom died in 2009. I'd been away at college then, and when I came back for the funeral, the orchard was already starting its slow surrender to nature. Now it looked like something out of a fairy tale, the kind that doesn't end well. I'd hired a local kid, Andrew Brennan, to help me haul stuff to the dump. His mom had been friends with my mom back in high school, and he needed money for community college. He showed up on Monday morning in a pickup truck that sounded like it was held together by prayer and duct tape. We started in the attic, where Dad had stored everything he couldn't bear to throw away. Boxes of Christmas decorations, old tax returns, my school projects from elementary school. It was going to be a long 2 weeks. The photo fell out of a water-damaged cardboard box labeled Kitchen Misc in Mom's handwriting. I almost missed it, would have if the corner hadn't caught the light just right. It was a Polaroid. The colors faded to that weird orange-yellow tint they get after a few decades. 5 teenage girls stood in a line, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. They were dressed in that unmistakable late 80s style, all big hair and acid-wash denim and neon windbreakers. I recognized Mom immediately, second from the left, her dark hair permed into oblivion. She couldn't have been more than 16, maybe 17. The photo had been taken in front of our orchard. I could see the neat rows of apple trees in the background before they'd gone wild. Someone had written on the white border at the bottom in blue pen, "Summer 1987, best friends forever." I flipped it over. On the back, in different handwriting, were 5 names: Diane, Julie, Mom's name, Vanessa, and Christine. I'd never seen this photo before. Mom had hardly any pictures from her teenage years, said she didn't like having her photo taken back then. But here she was, looking genuinely happy, surrounded by girls I'd never heard her mention. I showed it to Andrew, who was wrestling with a box of old National Geographic magazines. He glanced at it and shrugged. "Looks like your mom had friends," he said. "That's the orchard, right?" Before it went crazy. I asked if he recognized any of the other girls, if their families still lived in town. He squinted at the photo, then pointed to the girl on the far right, a blonde with a prominent gap between her front teeth. That might be Christine Holloway. "There's still a Holloway family on Birch Road, but I don't know if they're related." He handed the photo back to me and went back to the magazines. Something about it bothered me, though, the way it had been tucked away in a random box, like someone had hidden it deliberately. That night after Andrew left, I sat at the kitchen table with a bottle of Dad's old whiskey and stared at those 5 smiling faces. Mom's smile looked different than I remembered it, more open, less weighted down by whatever had made her so quiet in her later years. The next morning, I drove into town with the photo in my jacket pocket. The Millbridge Public Library was in the same building as the town hall, a brick structure that smelled like old paper and floor wax. Mrs. Galloway, the librarian who'd been there since before I was born, looked up from her desk with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes when I walked in. I told her I was doing some family history research, that I'd found an old photo of my mom and wanted to learn more about her friends. She got very still when I showed her the picture. Her finger traced over the faces, lingering on each one. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I told her it had been in a box in the attic. She handed it back quickly, like it had burned her. "Those girls," she said, then stopped. "Most of them moved away a long time ago. You know how it is with small towns? People leave." But there was something in the way she said it, something rehearsed, like she'd told this story before and had gotten good at making it sound casual. I pressed her, asked specifically about each name. Mrs. Galloway's jaw tightened. "Diane moved to California in 1988. Julie, I think she went to New York. Vanessa, maybe Florida. Christine stayed the longest, but she left too. Must have been 1989 or 1990. Every answer came out too quickly, too prepared. I asked if she had yearbooks from that era. Maybe I could find more information about them. She told me the yearbooks from those years had been damaged in a flood in the basement back in 2003. Most of them were thrown out. Convenient, I thought, but didn't say. I thanked her and left, but as I reached the door, she called out, "Your mother wouldn't want you digging into this." I turned around. "Into what?" She just shook her head and went back to her computer, fingers trembling slightly as they found the keyboard. Outside, I sat in my car for a long time, engine running, heat blasting. The whole conversation felt wrong. People don't react like that to a simple question about old high school friends, not unless there's something to hide. I spent the rest of that day at the town hall, going through old newspaper archives on microfiche. The Millbridge Gazette was a weekly paper, mostly local sports and town council meetings, but I figured disappearances would make the news. I searched every issue from 1987 through 1992. Nothing. Not a single article about missing girls, runaways, or disappearances. There were obituaries, sure, but none for anyone matching those names or ages. What I did find was strange in its absence. There were gaps in the papers, issues that should have existed but didn't. July 1987 was missing. October 1988 had 3 consecutive weeks gone. Spring of 1989, another gap. I asked the clerk about it, a young guy who clearly didn't care much about his job. He said sometimes issues got damaged or lost over the years, it happens, but the pattern felt deliberate. Those weren't random gaps. I drove to the address Andrew had mentioned, the Holloway place on Birch Road. It was a small ranch house with peeling yellow paint and a yard full of cars in various states of disrepair. An older man answered the door, maybe in his 70s, with suspicious eyes and a Boston Red Sox cap pulled low. I introduced myself, said I was looking for information about Christine Holloway. His face changed instantly, not sad, but angry. "You a reporter?" he asked, his hand tightening on the doorframe. I told him no, that I was just trying to learn about my mom's old friends. He stared at me for a long moment, then said, "Christine ran away in 1989. Took off in the middle of the night, didn't leave a note, nothing. Police said she was 18, free to go where she wanted. End of story." But his voice cracked when he said her name. I asked if he'd ever heard from her after she left. He shook his head. "Not a word in 36 years. Her mother died thinking Christine hated us. You want to know the truth? The truth is this town let her disappear and nobody gave a damn." He started to close the door, then stopped. "Your uncle was the police chief back then, Harold Weaver. He told us Christine was a troubled girl, that she'd probably gone to find herself in some city somewhere. He said we should let it go, that she'd come back when she was ready. We believed him." The door shut in my face before I could respond. Uncle Harold. Mom's older brother, the one who died of a heart attack when I was 12. I barely remembered him, just a stern man in a uniform who showed up at family holidays and didn't smile much. When I got back to the house, Andrew was loading broken furniture into his truck. I asked him if he knew anything about girls disappearing in the late 80s. He stopped mid-lift, an old chair suspended in his arms. "My mom mentioned something once," he said slowly. "She said there were some girls who left town back when she was in high school. But she got really weird when I asked about it, told me it was ancient history and I should focus on my own life." He set the chair down. "Why are you asking?" I showed him the photo again, explained what I'd learned. He looked uncomfortable. "Look, I need this job, but I don't want to get involved in something that's going to piss off the whole town. My family lives here." I told him I understood, that he didn't have to help me with this part. But then he said something that made my chest tighten. "There's an old storage unit out by Route 7. Police department used to keep evidence there before they built the new station. My uncle works maintenance for the facility. He said most of the old units haven't been touched in decades. If your uncle kept anything, it might still be there." That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Mom, about how quiet she'd been my whole life, how she never talked about her childhood or her friends, how she'd sometimes stare out at the orchard with this look on her face, like she was seeing something that wasn't there anymore. I'd always assumed she was just sad about getting older, about how time changes things. But now I wondered if she'd been carrying something heavier. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and went down to the kitchen. The house made different sounds at night, creaks and groans I'd forgotten about. I made coffee and sat at the table with my laptop, searching for any information I could find about the other girls. Diane, Julie, Vanessa. Nothing came up. No social media profiles, no obituaries, no marriage records, nothing. It was like they'd been erased. 5 girls in one photo, and 4 of them had vanished without leaving a single digital footprint. In a world where everyone exists online in some form, that kind of absence isn't accidental. Somebody had worked very hard to make sure these girls stayed gone, at least on paper. I thought about Uncle Harold, about his position of authority, about how easy it would be for a small-town police chief to make inconvenient questions disappear along with inconvenient people. The storage facility was a depressing row of metal units behind a chain-link fence, the kind of place that rents month to month and doesn't ask questions. Andrew's uncle, a heavy-set man named Don with nicotine-stained fingers, met me there on Wednesday morning. I'd told him I was looking for some of my uncle's old police files for a family history project. He didn't seem to care either way. "Unit 23, he said, handing me a key that looked like it hadn't been used in years. "Haven't seen anyone access that one since before I started working here, and that was 2007. You find anything valuable? The department technically still owns it." The unit smelled like mildew and rust when I rolled up the door. Boxes were stacked to the ceiling, most of them labeled with case numbers and dates. I started pulling them down, searching for anything from 1987 to 1990. Most of it was routine stuff, traffic violations, petty theft reports, one domestic dispute case. Then, in a box marked MISC 1988-1989, I found a folder that made my hands go numb. It was labeled Informal Investigations, in Uncle Harold's handwriting. Inside were newspaper clippings from other states, articles about unidentified remains found in rural areas. He'd circled certain details in red pen, details about age, gender, approximate time of death. There were also Polaroids, dozens of them, taken in the orchard behind my house. They showed disturbed earth, areas where the ground had clearly been dug up and refilled. Each photo had a date written on the back: July 1987, October 1988, April 1989, May 1989. My legs gave out and I sat down hard on the concrete floor. The dates matched the gaps in the newspaper archives. They matched the timeline of when the girls supposedly ran away. I pulled out my phone with shaking fingers and took pictures of everything in that folder. Every article, every photo, every note. There was a handwritten log too, Uncle Harold's daily notes. Most entries were mundane, but scattered throughout were lines that made my stomach turn. "Spoke with Holloway family again." They're accepting the runaway story. Diane's parents finally stopped calling. Convincing people these girls wanted to leave is easier than I thought. Small-town prejudices work in my favor. And then, near the end of the log, one entry that broke something inside me. Spoke to my sister today. She knows, she's always known. But she won't say anything. Family protects family, even when it shouldn't. My mother had known. She'd known what happened to her friends, and she'd stayed silent for the rest of her life, carrying that weight alone because her brother was a murderer and she couldn't bring herself to turn him in. I drove straight to the Vermont State Police Barracks in Rutland, 40 minutes away, with the folder on my passenger seat. I didn't trust anyone in Millbridge. The detective I spoke with, a woman named Carver, listened to everything without interrupting. When I showed her the photos and the log, her expression went from skeptical to grave. She made calls, and within hours, a forensics team was on its way to my property. They spent 3 days searching the orchard with ground-penetrating radar. They found 4 sets of remains buried in shallow graves exactly where Uncle Harold's photos indicated. Diane, Julie, Vanessa, and Christine. The 5th girl in the photo, my mother, had been the sole survivor, the one who got away because she was his sister. And even monsters sometimes have limits. The town exploded with the news. Some people were horrified, others were angry that I'd dug up the past. Mrs. Galloway refused to speak to anyone. Christine's father called me, sobbing, saying he'd waited 36 years to know what happened to his daughter, and thanking me for giving him that closure, even though it came with such terrible truth. I sold the house within a month. Couldn't stand to be there anymore. The orchard was excavated completely, turned into a memorial garden for the victims. Before I left Vermont for good, I went back one last time and stood where that photo had been taken in 1987. 5 girls smiling at the camera, none of them knowing that 4 would be dead within 2 years, and the 5th would spend the rest of her life drowning in guilt and silence. I understood now why Mom had been so quiet, why she never wanted to talk about her past, why she'd look at the orchard with that haunted expression. She'd been looking at their graves, living above the evidence of her brother's crimes, knowing the truth but never speaking it, protecting a monster because he was family. I'll never know if she stayed silent out of fear or misplaced loyalty, and maybe it doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that those 4 girls finally got to go home to their families, even if it was 3 decades too late. I still have that photo, tucked away in a drawer I rarely open. Sometimes I take it out and look at those 5 faces, all that youth and possibility, and I think about how one person's evil can ripple through generations, destroying not just the victims but everyone connected to them. The house sold to a family from Massachusetts who had no idea about its history. I didn't tell them. Maybe that makes me like my mother, keeping secrets to protect people from ugly truths. Or maybe some stories need to be buried along with the dead. I don't know anymore. What I do know is that I'll never go back to Millbridge, and every time I see an apple orchard, I drive past it as fast as I can. People always ask why I became a journalist, and I usually give them some noble answer about truth and accountability. The real reason is simpler and darker than that. It started the day I came home to Cypress Bend, Louisiana to pack up my father's house after his funeral. Dad had been the town clerk for 40 years before retiring in 2014, and he'd kept everything. Every document, every file, every scrap of paper that passed through the municipal building ended up in our garage or attic. My older sister Kathleen refused to deal with it, said she had 3 kids and a husband to worry about, so the job fell to me. I'd just turned 36 the week before Dad died. No wife, no kids, just a decent job at a newspaper in Atlanta covering city council meetings and zoning disputes, the kind of stories that put people to sleep. I took a month's leave and drove the 9 hours back to the place I'd spent my whole childhood trying to escape. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the way childhood places always do. It sat on Magnolia Avenue, a street that used to be nice before the chemical plant laid off half the town in 2008. Dad's Toyota was still in the driveway, covered in that yellow pollen that coats everything in Louisiana during spring. It was a Saturday in May, humid as hell, and the cicadas were already screaming in the oak trees. I'd been dreading this for weeks, not just because of the grief, but because I knew what waited inside. Dad had been a hoarder of the bureaucratic kind. The living room was stacked with banker's boxes, the hallway lined with filing cabinets, the spare bedroom converted into what he called his archive. Mom had left him over it back when I was in college, said she couldn't live in a museum anymore. She'd remarried and moved to Florida, sent flowers to the funeral but didn't come. I couldn't blame her. The house smelled like old paper and the lemon cleaner Dad used obsessively, trying to keep the mold at bay. I stood in the doorway with my duffel bag, looking at the mountain of work ahead, and seriously considered just hiring an estate sale company to deal with all of it. I started in the garage because it seemed the least personal. Boxes were stacked to the ceiling, labeled in Dad's careful block letters. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Tax records, water bills from 1987, permits for shed construction, complaints about barking dogs, boring, mundane stuff that should have been thrown out decades ago. I worked methodically, creating piles for trash, recycling, and the maybe 5% worth keeping. By noon, I was covered in dust and spider webs, my back aching from bending over boxes. I'd filled 6 garbage bags and barely made a dent. That's when I found them, pushed way back in the corner behind a rusted lawnmower and some old paint cans. 4 boxes, sealed with packing tape that had gone brown and brittle with age. The labels were different from Dad's usual style, written in black marker, hurried and uneven. Flood Relief 93, do not open. The thing is, I remembered 1993. I was 7 years old when the flood hit. School got canceled for 2 weeks, and we had to stay with my aunt in Baton Rouge because water came up to our porch steps. It was the biggest disaster in Cypress Bend's history, the whole downtown underwater, people living in the high school gymnasium for months. But what struck me standing in that garage was the second part of the label. Why would Dad write, "Do not open," on relief documents? I pulled one of the boxes out, the cardboard soft with moisture damage despite being sealed. It was heavier than I expected. I carried it to Dad's workbench and grabbed a utility knife from the pegboard. My journalist instincts were kicking in now, that familiar buzz I got when something didn't add up. I cut through the tape, and the smell hit me first. Old paper, but also something else, something chemical and wrong. Inside were files, hundreds of them, organized with the same precision Dad brought to everything. But these weren't relief documents. They were missing persons reports. Dozens of them, maybe 50 or 60 in just this one box. Each form was the official kind, the Louisiana State Police template with the seal at the top. But someone had stamped them all with red ink. Not processed. I pulled one out at random. A woman named Gloria Thibodeau, 41 years old, last seen at her home on Riverside Court on Wednesday, June 9, 1993. The report was filed by her sister on June 15th. There was a Polaroid photo paper-clipped to the form, showing a smiling woman with dark curly hair standing in front of a small yellow house. I grabbed another file. James Ortega, 19, last seen leaving his job at the marina on the same date, June 9th. Another photo, a skinny kid with a work uniform and a shy smile. Then another, Carolyn Dufresne and her 2 daughters, ages 8 and 11. All last seen June 9th, 1993. All reported missing in the days after. All stamped, not processed. My heart started pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the garage heat. June 9th, 1993 was the day the levee broke. I remembered because it was my grandmother's birthday, and we were supposed to have cake that evening, but never did because the sirens started going off around 3 in the afternoon. The Riverside neighborhood got hit first and worst, the water coming in so fast that people barely had time to get to their roofs. The news said it was 20 feet deep in some places. I grabbed my phone and started Googling pulling up the old newspaper archives from the Cypress Bend Chronicle. The official death toll from the flood was listed as 7 people. 7. I had at least 30 missing persons reports in my hands from just one box, and there were 3 more boxes in that corner. I started pulling files faster, my hands getting that tremble you get when you're onto something big. Every single report had the same date, June 9th, 1993. Every single person was from Riverside, and every single form had that red stamp. Someone had deliberately not processed these reports. Someone had made these people disappear from the official record. I spent the next 4 hours going through all 4 boxes. By the time I finished, I'd counted 147 missing persons reports. 147 people who vanished the day of the flood, all from the same neighborhood, all officially erased. The files included everything you'd expect: detailed descriptions, last known locations, family contacts, even some personal effects that had been turned in. A wallet, a set of house keys, a child's stuffed rabbit, water-stained and falling apart. Someone had taken these reports seriously enough to collect evidence, but then buried them. I found something else too, tucked into the bottom of the last box. A manila envelope marked, "Engineering Survey, Confidential." Inside were blueprints of the levee system, covered in notations and calculations in different handwriting. Yellow sticky notes were attached to several pages, and one note made my stomach turn. It was dated June 8th, 1993, the day before the flood. The handwriting was shaky but legible. Charges placed as requested. Primary breach point north sector will direct flow to Riverside. Detonation window 2:04 p.m. Wednesday. God forgive us. I sat down hard on Dad's workbench stool, my legs suddenly unreliable. Someone had blown the levee on purpose. They deliberately flooded Riverside, and my father had known about it. The evidence was in his garage, hidden for 31 years. I thought about Dad's last few months, how he'd gotten quiet and withdrawn, how he'd stopped going to church even though he'd been an usher for 20 years. How he'd called me 3 times in the weeks before his heart attack, leaving rambling messages about needing to tell me something important. But I'd been busy with a story deadline, and kept saying I'd call him back later. I never did. Now he was gone, and I was holding proof of mass murder. I pulled out my laptop and started searching for anything about Riverside neighborhood. What I found made everything worse. After the flood, the land had been declared unusable, too damaged to rebuild. The entire neighborhood, 43 acres, had been sold to a development company for next to nothing. That company was owned by the Prudhomme family. Everyone in Cypress Bend knew the Prudhommes. They owned half the parish, had for generations. Sugar cane plantations, timber operations, commercial real estate. The family estate sat on a hill overlooking the river, a white mansion with columns that had been there since before the Civil War. In 1993, the patriarch was Jean-Paul Prudhomme, and according to the property records I was pulling up, his holdings had been directly upstream from Riverside. If the levee had broken naturally where it was supposed to, the water would have flooded his processing plant and 5,000 acres of prime agricultural land. But by breaching it at the north sector instead, the water got diverted away from his property and straight into Riverside, a poor neighborhood where most people rented, where nobody had the money or connections to fight back. I found a photo from the Chronicle dated June 11th, 1993, showing Jean-Paul touring the flood damage with the governor. He looked concerned in that practiced way rich people do, wearing rubber boots that probably cost more than most people's rent. The caption mentioned his generous donation to the relief fund. Blood money. I couldn't stay in that garage anymore. I loaded all 4 boxes into my car, then went back for the engineering documents. It was almost 7 in the evening, the sun setting orange and angry through the humidity. I sat in my car with the air conditioning blasting, trying to figure out what to do next. The smart move would be to call the FBI, hand everything over, let the professionals handle it. But I'd been a journalist long enough to know how these things went. The Prudhommes had money, real money. The kind that bought lawyers and politicians and made evidence disappear. Jean-Paul was dead now, had been for a decade, but his son Olivier ran the family business and sat on every important board in the parish. One phone call from him and this whole thing could get buried again, just like Dad had buried it. No, I needed to document everything first, build an airtight case, and then go public in a way that couldn't be ignored. I drove to the one place in Cypress Bend I knew would have the records I needed, the parish courthouse. The building was closed, but I'd grown up in this town and knew things tourists didn't. The records room had a separate entrance in the back, and the night security guard was Billy Fontaine, who'd been 2 grades ahead of me in school. I knocked on the maintenance door until he opened it, looking annoyed until he recognized me. We talked for 10 minutes about Dad's funeral, about his own father's diabetes, about how the town wasn't what it used to be. Then I told him I needed to look at some property records for a story I was writing, and he let me in without asking questions. Small town courtesy, the kind that can save you or destroy you depending on who's watching. I spent 3 hours in that records room, photographing everything. Deeds, tax assessments, water management reports, environmental surveys. I found the original engineering specifications for the levee, which showed the north sector was actually reinforced concrete, the strongest point in the entire system. For it to fail there naturally would have been nearly impossible. I found insurance claims too, dozens of them, all denied because flood insurance didn't cover acts of God back then. People lost everything and got nothing. The last thing I found was a memo dated June 15, 1993, from the Parish Emergency Management Office to all local law enforcement. It ordered them to halt processing of any missing persons reports from Riverside until further notice, citing the need to avoid premature panic and allow time for thorough rescue operations. The memo was signed by the emergency coordinator, a man named Frank Boudreau, but at the bottom was a handwritten note, per prud'homme request. That's when I understood what Dad had done. He hadn't been part of the conspiracy. He'd been the one person who'd refused to destroy the evidence. Everyone else had followed orders, but Dad had kept those reports, hidden them, preserved them for 31 years until someone could do something about it. He'd tried to tell me before he died, and I'd been too busy to listen. I left the courthouse at midnight with my phone full of documentation and a plan forming in my head. I couldn't trust the local police. Half of them probably owed their jobs to Prud'homme donations. But I had friends at the Times-Picayune in New Orleans, and I had enough evidence to make this national news. I drove back to Dad's house, uploaded everything to 3 different cloud services, and sent encrypted files to 2 journalist colleagues with instructions to publish if anything happened to me. Then I finally allowed myself to feel it, the weight of what I'd discovered, and I cried for the first time since Dad's funeral. The story broke 6 days later. I'd spent that time tracking down survivors, people who'd lost family members in Riverside and never got answers. Most had moved away, scattered across Louisiana and beyond, but they all remembered. They remembered filing reports that went nowhere, remembered being told their loved ones probably just left town, remembered the way people stopped asking questions when the Prud'homme name came up. I interviewed 23 people, recorded every conversation, documented every detail. When the Times-Picayune published the first article, it included photographs of the missing persons reports, scans of the engineering documents, and testimony from the survivors. The headline read, "Cypress Bend Flood of '93. New evidence suggests deliberate levee breach killed over 140. Within hours, every major news outlet in the country picked it up. CNN, NBC, The Washington Post. By the end of the week, the FBI had opened an investigation, and the Louisiana Attorney General announced a special task force. Olivier Prud'homme released a statement calling the allegations baseless and defamatory, but his lawyers couldn't explain away the documents. The physical evidence was too damning, too specific, too real. 3 months later, they found the bodies. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the old Riverside neighborhood which was now a shopping center and parking lot, revealed multiple unmarked burial sites. The excavation took weeks, but they eventually recovered remains of 68 people, including children. DNA testing confirmed their identities matched names from Dad's missing persons reports. The medical examiner determined most had drowned, but some showed signs of blunt force trauma, suggesting they'd been caught in the initial blast when the levee was breached. Olivier Prudhomme was indicted on charges of obstruction of justice and conspiracy to conceal evidence. He maintained his father had acted alone, but financial records showed he'd paid off 3 parish officials as recently as 2023 to keep the Riverside files sealed. Frank Boudreau, the old emergency coordinator, confessed in exchange for immunity. He confirmed Jean-Paul Prudhomme had ordered the levee breach and paid the demolition crew $500,000 in cash. The crew members were dead now, conveniently all of natural causes over the past decade. But Boudreau's testimony was enough. The trial starts next month, and I'll be there to cover every minute of it. I still live in Cypress Bend now. Quit my job in Atlanta and took a position at the Chronicle, the same paper that once published puff pieces about Jean-Paul's charity work. They made me investigative editor, gave me full freedom to dig into whatever stories the town tried to bury. Kathleen speaks to me again, said she's proud of what I did, even if it means the family name is complicated around here. Some people treat me like a hero, others won't make eye contact at the grocery store. The Prudhommes still have friends, still have money, still have power, but they don't have silence anymore. Dad's house sold last month, and I used part of the money to help fund a memorial for the Riverside victims. It's a simple granite wall with all 147 names engraved, located on the only piece of the old neighborhood that wasn't developed, a small park by the river. At the dedication ceremony, survivors came from all over the country. They touched the names, cried, finally had a place to grieve. I think about Dad standing in that garage looking at those boxes year after year, carrying the weight of what he knew and couldn't fix. He did what he could with what he had, and in the end, that was enough. The truth came out, even if it took 31 years and his death to make it happen. Sometimes justice is just someone refusing to let the world forget. Honestly, I never thought I'd be the person posting something like this online, but I need to get it out somewhere because talking about it in person makes me feel sick all over again. My wife Claire and I got married in June 2014, right after I finished my teaching degree. We were broke as hell, living off her salary as a dental hygienist while I scrambled for substitute teaching gigs around the county. When we found that rental house on the edge of Fairmont, Pennsylvania, it felt like we'd won the lottery. 2 bedrooms, hardwood floors, a little backyard for the dog we planned to get someday, all for $800 a month. The landlord, this guy named Vincent Marsh, seemed normal enough when we met him at the property. Mid-50s, thinning gray hair, wore these thick-framed glasses that made his eyes look huge. He smiled a lot, maybe too much, but we figured he was just eager to rent the place after it sat empty for 3 months. We moved in on a Saturday in late July, and I remember thinking the house had good bones despite the outdated wallpaper and the weird, musty smell in the hallway closet. Claire was already planning which walls we'd repaint, talking about hanging curtains in the bedroom to block out the streetlight that shone directly through our window at night. That first week felt like playing house, you know. We'd order pizza and eat it on the floor, because our furniture hadn't arrived yet, making plans about the life we were going to build there. Vincent stopped by twice that week, once to fix a leaky faucet and another time to check the furnace before winter, he said. Both times he lingered longer than necessary, asking questions about our schedules, when we'd be home, whether we were light sleepers. Claire mentioned later that she thought it was weird how he kept glancing toward our bedroom door, but I brushed it off. Landlords are nosy, right? They want to make sure you're not trashing their property. I wish I'd paid more attention to the way his hands trembled when he handed me his business card. or how he wrote his personal cell number on the back in pen that smudged across the paper like he'd been sweating. It was Claire who noticed the first hole. We'd been living there almost 3 weeks when she decided to rearrange the bedroom furniture. She wanted the bed against the far wall instead of under the window. Thought it would help us sleep better without that streetlight blazing into our faces every night. When we pushed the dresser away from the corner, there it was, right at eye level if you were standing in the hallway outside. A perfectly round hole, maybe half an inch across, drilled straight through the drywall. The edges were smooth, deliberate, and when I put my eye up to it, I could see directly into our bedroom, a clear view of where our bed had been positioned for the past 3 weeks. My throat got tight. Claire grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging in hard enough to leave marks. We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably just a minute, both of us trying to rationalize it. Maybe the previous tenant hung something heavy. Maybe there was some electrical work done, but the hole was too clean, too purposeful, and it was aimed at exactly the right height and angle. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and started checking the other walls, moving furniture, pulling down the few pictures we'd hung. We found 2 more in the bedroom alone. One behind the nightstand on Claire's side, another near the closet that gave a perfect view of where she changed clothes every morning before work. The panic really set in when we checked the bathroom. I had to move the towel rack to find it, but there it was. Another hole drilled through the wall that separated the bathroom from the utility closet in the hallway. This one was positioned to see directly into the shower. Claire started crying, the kind of crying where you can't catch your breath, and I felt this rage building in my chest that made my vision blur at the edges. We'd been showering there for 3 weeks. We'd been sleeping there, changing there, doing everything married people do in the privacy of their own home. I wanted to punch something, wanted to drive straight to Vincent's house and drag him out by his collar, but Claire begged me to call the police first. She was shaking so badly I had to dial the number for her. When the dispatcher answered, I tried to explain what we'd found, but the words came out jumbled and probably didn't make much sense. The dispatcher kept asking if we were in immediate danger, if someone was in the house right now, and I kept saying no, but yes. Someone had been watching us. Someone had violated us in a way I couldn't even articulate. They said they'd send an officer over within the hour. That hour felt like a decade. While we waited, I couldn't just sit there. I went into the hallway closet, the one with that musty smell we'd never bothered investigating, and started pulling out the boxes of Christmas decorations and old paint cans the previous tenant had left behind. At the back of the closet, behind a sheet of plywood leaning against the wall, I found the access panel to the crawl space above the first floor. The panel wasn't screwed in like it should have been. It just lifted right off. I grabbed a chair from the kitchen, boosted myself up, and shone the flashlight into the darkness above. What I saw made my stomach turn inside out. There were wires everywhere, thin black cables running along the ceiling joists like veins, all converging toward a central point above our bedroom. I followed them with the flashlight beam and found a small metal box bolted to a beam, about the size of a lunchbox, with more wires feeding into it from different directions. Some of the cables disappeared into holes drilled down through the ceiling, positioned exactly where we'd found the holes in the walls below. I'm not an electrician, but I knew enough to recognize that this wasn't original wiring. This was new, maybe a few months old based on how clean the plastic coating looked. Claire called up to me asking what I'd found, but I couldn't form words. I just climbed down and showed her the pictures I'd taken on my phone. Her face went completely white. The officer who showed up was young, couldn't have been more than a year or 2 out of the academy. His name was Officer Reynolds, and he had this uncomfortable expression like he'd been expecting a noise complaint, not whatever mess we were describing. He looked at the holes, took some pictures with a department camera, then asked if he could see the crawl space. I took him up there, and I watched his expression change from skeptical to deeply concerned as he swept his own flashlight across the wiring. He made a phone call, spoke in that clipped cop voice they use on radios, and within 20 minutes, 2 detectives showed up. Detective Brenner was older, maybe 50, with gray stubble and tired eyes that had seen too much. His partner was a woman named Detective Huang, sharp and focused, already pulling on latex gloves before she'd even climbed into the crawl space. They spent 45 minutes up there talking in low voices we couldn't quite hear, occasionally asking us questions through the opening. Had we touched anything? Had we noticed anyone unusual around the property? Did the landlord have keys? That last question hit different. Of course he had keys. He was the landlord. He could come and go whenever he wanted, and we'd never know. Detective Huang came down from the crawl space holding an evidence bag with the metal box inside. She set it on our kitchen table like it was radioactive, and Brenner explained what they'd found. The box was a wireless transmitter, the kind you could buy online for a few $100s, designed to send video signals to a remote receiver. The wires fed into tiny cameras, pinhole style, fitted into the holes we'd discovered. 4 cameras total, they'd counted. Bedroom, bathroom, and 2 in the living room we hadn't even found yet because they were hidden behind air vents. Huang asked if we'd given permission for any surveillance equipment, which was such an absurd question I almost laughed. Then Brenner asked for Vincent's contact information, and I handed over that business card with his smudged cell number. They tried calling him right there in front of us. It rang 6 times and went to voicemail. Brenner left a message, professional and calm, asking Vincent to call back regarding an urgent matter at the property. We all knew he wouldn't call back. You could see it in the way the detectives looked at each other. That silent communication cops develop after working together long enough. Huang asked if we had anywhere else to stay tonight. The way she said it, like it wasn't really a question, made it clear we shouldn't be sleeping there. We ended up at Claire's parents' house in Harrisburg, about an hour away. Her mom kept trying to make tea and asking if we were hungry, doing that thing parents do when they don't know how to fix something, so they offer food instead. Claire's dad just sat there looking furious, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that metal box, those wires, Vincent's huge eyes behind those thick glasses staring at footage of us in our most private moments. How long had he been watching? Had he watched us on our wedding night when we came home late and exhausted? Had he seen every fight, every intimate moment, every time we walked around in our underwear thinking we were alone? The violation of it felt like something crawling under my skin. The next morning, Brenner called my cell. They'd gone to the address listed on Vincent's landlord registration. The house was empty. Not just empty like he wasn't home, but empty like he'd cleared out in a hurry. Neighbors said they'd seen him loading boxes into a van around midnight, just hours after we'd called the police. His cell phone was going straight to voicemail now, probably turned off or destroyed. They'd put out a bulletin for his vehicle, a white cargo van with Pennsylvania plates, but Brenner didn't sound optimistic about finding him quickly. What happened next is the part that still keeps me awake sometimes. 3 days after Vincent disappeared, Detective Huang called and asked if we could come down to the station. When we got there, she led us into a conference room where Brenner had spread out papers and photographs across the table, like some kind of horrifying puzzle. They'd started digging into Vincent's background, pulling property records and cross-referencing rental listings. Turns out our house wasn't the only one. Vincent owned 6 rental properties scattered across 3 counties in central Pennsylvania, all advertised as affordable housing for young couples and single women. The detectives had obtained warrants and searched every single property. 5 of them had the same setup. Holes in the walls, cameras hidden in bedrooms and bathrooms, wiring running to transmitters in crawl spaces or attics. One house in Altoona had 8 cameras installed. 8. Huang showed us a spreadsheet she'd created, listing the current and former tenants they'd identified going back 3 years. 22 people had lived in those houses during that time. 22 people who had no idea they'd been watched, recorded, violated in their own homes. Some had already moved away, gotten married, started families. The detectives were in the process of contacting everyone, and I could see the weight of it on Huang's face. knowing she'd have to make those phone calls and destroy people's sense of safety and privacy all over again. Brenner pulled out another folder, this one thicker, and explained that they'd executed a warrant for Vincent's financial records. He'd been paying for cloud storage, massive amounts of it, through an offshore service that specialized in, let's say, discretionary data hosting. The kind of service that doesn't ask questions and doesn't cooperate easily with law enforcement. They were working with federal investigators now because the scope had expanded beyond local jurisdiction. The FBI Cybercrimes Unit was involved, trying to trace where the footage had been uploaded and whether Vincent had distributed or sold any of it. That word "sold" hit me like a hammer. The idea that strangers might have paid money to watch me and Claire in our bedroom, that our most private moments might be saved on some server in another country, being traded around by people whose faces we'd never see. It made me want to vomit right there on the conference room table. Claire started crying again, and Huang pushed a box of tissues across the table with the kind of practiced gentleness that told me she'd done this too many times before. Brenner said they'd keep us updated, that they were doing everything possible to track Vincent down and secure any footage that might exist. But I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The internet is vast. Data can be copied, backed up, hidden in places even experts struggle to find. We never went back to that house. Claire couldn't even drive past the street without having a panic attack, and honestly, neither could I. We broke the lease, which legally we probably didn't have to do given the circumstances, but I didn't want to spend another second tied to anything Vincent owned. We moved into a cramped apartment in Harrisburg, closer to Claire's work and her family, a place with new construction and walls we could verify were solid all the way through. I became obsessive about checking for cameras. Every hotel room, every Airbnb, even bathrooms at friends' houses, I'd find myself scanning the walls and ceilings, looking for tiny holes or unusual objects positioned at weird angles. Claire started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma. She'd come home from sessions exhausted and raw, and some nights she'd just sit on the couch staring at nothing while I made dinner neither of us wanted to eat. Our marriage took a hit. Not because we blamed each other, but because the invasion had poisoned something fundamental between us. Intimacy became complicated, loaded with the knowledge that someone had stolen it from us, and we could never get it back. We got through it, slowly, with a lot of therapy and patience and honest conversations that hurt like open wounds. But it changed us. You don't come back from something like that completely whole. Vincent Marsh was arrested 4 months later at a border crossing in Texas, trying to get into Mexico with fake identification. The cargo van was full of hard drives and equipment. Turns out he'd been planning this for a while, had money stashed in accounts under different names, probably anticipating the day someone would discover what he'd been doing. The trial took 2 years, dragged out by legal motions and evidence processing. The FBI recovered footage from multiple cloud accounts, thousands of hours of recordings spanning back to 2011. He'd been doing this for at least a decade, maybe longer. 22 victims became 43 as more people came forward after seeing news coverage. Some of the footage had been sold on dark web forums, distributed to networks of people who paid subscription fees to watch real surveillance of unsuspecting people. Vincent pleaded guilty eventually, probably because his lawyers knew a jury would bury him. He got 38 years in federal prison, no parole. He'll be 90 when he's eligible for release, if he lives that long. Huang called me the day the sentence came down. She said it was one of the longest sentences she'd seen for this type of crime, that the judge had been visibly disgusted during sentencing. It should have felt like victory, like justice, but mostly I just felt tired. Claire and I were in our new house by then, a place we'd bought instead of rented, where we'd personally inspected every inch before signing the papers. We're okay now, or as okay as you can be after something like this. We don't talk about it much anymore, but sometimes I catch Claire staring at a wall with that distant look, and I know she's back there, in that bedroom on the edge of Fairmont, realizing someone was watching. The violation doesn't fade. You just learn to carry it differently. And every time I hear about someone finding a great deal on a rental, I want to tell them to check the walls first. Check everything. Because privacy is an illusion, and trust is a luxury not everyone deserves. Teaching 5th grade in Dalton felt like the kind of quiet life I needed after the chaos of my divorce 2 years prior. The town had maybe 8,000 people, tucked between the mountains in northwest Georgia, where everyone knew everyone and Sunday service at Covenant Fellowship wasn't optional if you wanted to fit in. I started attending because my principal, Mr. Warren, mentioned it during my interview, saying the church was the heart of the community and most of the school staff were members. Within my first month, I'd been welcomed with casseroles, invitations to potlucks, and warm smiles from people who seemed genuinely kind. The church itself was this beautiful old building with white columns and stained glass windows that threw colored light across the pews during morning service. Everything felt safe, normal, like I'd finally found a place where I could rebuild my life and focus on my students without the drama I'd left behind in Savannah. But sometime around mid-October, I started noticing small things that didn't quite add up. After service one Sunday, I saw 3 of my colleagues, including Beth Sullivan, who taught 3rd grade, huddled in the parking lot with Deacon Phillips and 2 other church elders I didn't know well. They were speaking in hushed tones, and when I waved at Beth, she looked almost startled before giving me this tight, forced smile and turning back to the group. The conversation stopped completely when I walked past them to my car. Then there was the Wednesday evening Bible study I'd started attending, where certain members would exchange these meaningful glances whenever someone mentioned the community committee, which I'd been told was just a charity organization that helped struggling families in the area. I'd asked about volunteering once, and the room had gone uncomfortably silent before someone changed the subject. People were friendly enough to my face, but I was starting to feel like there was this whole other layer to the church that I wasn't part of, like everyone was in on something I didn't understand. The warmth I'd initially felt was beginning to seem performative, calculated even, though I couldn't explain why I felt that way. The thing that really kicked everything into gear happened on a Monday morning in late October. I arrived at school to find out that Beth Sullivan had resigned effective immediately. No 2 weeks notice, no goodbye, nothing. Her classroom was already being packed up by the janitor, and when I asked Mr. Warren about it, he got this weird look on his face and said Beth had personal matters to attend to and had moved out of state to be with family. But here's the thing that made my stomach turn. I'd had coffee with Beth just 3 days earlier, on Friday afternoon, and she'd been excitedly planning her classroom Halloween party. She'd shown me the decorations she'd bought, talked about how her kids were going to love the costume contest, and mentioned she was hosting Thanksgiving at her house this year for the first time. She didn't seem like someone about to uproot her entire life. I tried calling her cell phone during my lunch break, and it went straight to a disconnected number message. Her Facebook page was gone. It was like she'd been erased. I couldn't stop thinking about it for the rest of the week. During Wednesday evening service, I noticed Beth's usual seat in the 4th pew was occupied by a family I'd never seen before, like the congregation had just moved on without missing a beat. After the service ended, I approached Deacon Phillips and asked if he knew how to reach Beth, saying I wanted to send her a card or something. The way his expression shifted made my chest tighten. He put his hand on my shoulder, this gesture that probably looked comforting to anyone watching, but his grip was firm enough to feel like a warning. He told me that Beth had made her choice, and it was best to respect her privacy and focus on my own responsibilities here. The way he emphasized here felt deliberate, pointed. When I mentioned that her phone was disconnected, he just smiled and said sometimes people need to make clean breaks, then walked away before I could ask anything else. That night, lying in bed, I kept replaying the conversation and realizing he'd never actually answered my question about how to contact her. Nobody had. The next Sunday, I decided to do something probably stupid, but I couldn't help myself. After service, I lingered near the fellowship hall where coffee and donuts were set up, and I started casually asking other members if they'd heard from Beth. The reactions were all variations of the same theme: awkward pauses, quick subject changes, or these rehearsed-sounding responses about respecting her decision and moving forward. But it was Margaret Torres, the church secretary who'd always been chatty with me, who really confirmed my suspicions. When I asked her, she actually glanced around nervously before leaning in close and whispering that I should stop asking questions about Beth. Her exact words were, "Some people aren't cut out for the level of commitment this community requires, and it's better for everyone when they realize that sooner rather than later." When I pressed her on what she meant by commitment, she straightened up, plastered on a smile, and said she had to help clean up, practically speed-walking away from me. The whole exchange lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it left me feeling genuinely unsettled. What kind of church talks about commitment like it's some binding contract you can't get out of? I started paying closer attention after that, really watching how people interacted. The community committee met every other Friday evening in the church basement, and I'd see the same group of maybe 20 people heading down there. Always the same faces, including Mr. Warren, Deacon Phillips, and several other teachers from school. They'd stay for exactly 2 hours, and when they came back up, they always looked serious, purposeful, like they'd just attended some important business meeting rather than a charity planning session. One Friday in early November, I made an excuse about leaving my sweater in the sanctuary and doubled back after everyone thought I'd left. I could hear voices coming from the basement, but the door at the top of the stairs was locked. I stood there for a minute, listening, and I could make out someone talking about maintaining the structure and ensuring compliance, which seemed like really weird language for organizing food drives or whatever they were supposedly doing. Then I heard footsteps coming up the stairs, and I had to scramble back to my car, my heart absolutely pounding, feeling like a kid who'd almost gotten caught doing something wrong. What really sent me down the rabbit hole was finding Beth's lesson planner in the supply closet at school. I'd gone in looking for construction paper for my class, and there it was, shoved behind some boxes on the top shelf like someone had hidden it quickly. Her handwriting was all over it, plans sketched out through December, parent conference notes, everything. On the inside cover, she'd written her sister's phone number in California with a note that said, "Emily, emergency contact." I took a photo of the number with my phone and called it that evening from my apartment. A woman answered, and when I explained who I was and asked about Beth, there was this long, painful silence before she said Beth hadn't contacted any family members. Emily's voice cracked when she told me she'd filed a missing person report 2 weeks ago, but the police in Dalton had told her that Beth had resigned from her job voluntarily, and there was no evidence of foul play, so they weren't investigating. Emily said she'd driven down from California to look for her sister, had gone to the church and spoken with Deacon Phillips, and he'd told her the same story about Beth moving away for personal reasons. But Emily knew her sister, knew Beth would never just vanish without telling family, and she'd left Dalton feeling like everyone was lying to her but having no proof of anything. After I hung up with Emily, I sat on my couch for probably an hour just trying to process what this meant. A woman had vanished, her own sister couldn't find her, and an entire church congregation was apparently okay with pretending everything was normal. I thought about going to the police myself, but what would I even say? That people at my church were acting weird and my colleague had quit her job? There was nothing concrete, nothing illegal that I could point to. The next day at school, I noticed Mr. Warren watching me more closely than usual during the staff meeting. When it ended, he asked me to stay behind, and once everyone else had filed out, he closed the door and sat on the edge of his desk in this casual way that somehow made the whole thing feel more threatening. He asked how I was adjusting to the community, if I felt welcomed at church, and then he said he'd heard I'd been asking a lot of questions about Beth Sullivan. The way he looked at me when he said it made my mouth go dry. I tried to play it off, said I was just concerned about a friend, but he cut me off and said that sometimes curiosity can make a person's life more complicated than it needs to be. Those were his exact words. Then he smiled, told me he was sure I understood, and suggested I focus on being a positive presence for my students rather than dwelling on people who'd chosen to move on. That conversation scared me more than anything else had up to that point, because it meant they knew I was digging and they were watching me. I decided to back off for a while, attend church like normal, smile and nod, and pretend everything was fine. But I also started documenting things, writing down dates and names and strange interactions in a notebook I kept hidden in my apartment. 2 weeks later, on a Wednesday evening, I got a knock on my door around 8 at night. When I looked through the peephole, I saw Deacon Phillips standing there with 2 other men from the community committee, both wearing suits despite the late hour. My entire body went cold. I considered not answering, but my car was parked right outside, and all the lights in my apartment were on, so they obviously knew I was home. When I opened the door with the chain still latched, Deacon Phillips gave me that same unsettling smile and said they'd like to talk to me about joining the community committee. He said I'd shown such dedication to the church and the school that they felt I'd be a perfect addition to their organization. The way he phrased it didn't sound like an invitation, it sounded like an inevitability. I told them through the gap in the door that I appreciated the offer, but I was still fairly new to the area and wanted to settle in more before taking on additional commitments. One of the other men, someone whose name I didn't know but who I'd seen at every service, stepped closer and said that membership in the committee wasn't really optional for people who were serious about being part of the Covenant Fellowship community. He said it in this matter-of-fact tone, like he was explaining simple math to a child. Deacon Phillips added that everyone at the church who held any position of influence or respect was part of the committee, and that my principal, Mr. Warren, had specifically recommended me. He said they had a special initiation meeting this coming Friday, and they'd expect to see me there at 7 in the evening. When I started to protest, to say I needed time to think about it, the third man finally spoke up and mentioned how unfortunate it had been that Beth Sullivan hadn't understood the importance of commitment, how she'd made things difficult for herself by trying to walk away. The implicit threat in his words was crystal clear. I managed to tell them I'd think about it and close the door, then immediately pushed my couch against it and spent the rest of the night planning what the hell I was going to do. I knew I couldn't just refuse and stay in Dalton. Whatever this community committee actually was, they clearly had enough influence to make people disappear without consequences, and the local police were either part of it or too intimidated to investigate. By Thursday morning, I'd made my decision. I called in sick to school, went to the bank and withdrew everything from my checking account, and started packing only what would fit in my car. I didn't give notice to my landlord, didn't tell anyone at school I was leaving, didn't post anything on social media. I loaded up my sedan that afternoon while most people were still at work, threw my notebook with all my documentation into my bag, and planned to leave Friday morning before dawn, hours before that 7 o'clock meeting they expected me at. But Thursday night, around 11, I heard footsteps on the stairs leading up to my second-floor apartment. Slow, deliberate footsteps, and then they stopped right outside my door. I held my breath in the darkness, watching the shadow of feet visible under the door gap. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. Then I heard a piece of paper slide under my door. When the footsteps finally retreated, I waited another 10 minutes before turning on a light and picking up the paper. It was a printed schedule for tomorrow's initiation ceremony, with my name already typed at the top, along with a note that said, "We look forward to welcoming you into our family. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity you won't want to miss." I didn't sleep at all that night. At 3 in the morning, I grabbed my bags, left my apartment key on the counter, and walked as quietly as I could down to my car. The street was completely empty and dark except for one streetlight flickering at the end of the block. I threw everything in the trunk, got in the driver's seat, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. Just as the engine started, I saw headlights turn onto my street from the far end. A dark SUV moving slowly, like it was patrolling. I didn't wait to see if it was coming for me. I pulled out and drove in the opposite direction, taking back roads out of town, constantly checking my rearview mirror for anyone following me. I drove for 6 hours straight, didn't stop except for gas, and ended up at my cousin's place in North Carolina by mid-morning. I stayed with her for 2 weeks, barely leaving her apartment, jumping at every unexpected sound. I finally worked up the courage to call Emily, Beth's sister, and told her everything that had happened to me. She broke down crying and said she'd suspected something like this but had no way to prove it. Together, we contacted the FBI field office in Charlotte, and I turned over my notebook with all the documentation. An agent took my statement and said they'd look into it, but warned me that without concrete evidence of a crime, there wasn't much they could do immediately. He did say that Dalton had come up before in relation to some financial irregularities involving a church organization, and my information might help build a case, but it could take months or even years. He strongly advised me not to return to Dalton under any circumstances. It's been 8 months since I left, and I'm teaching at a different school now in a different state, using my maiden name from before my marriage. I check the news from Dalton compulsively, looking for any updates, but there's been nothing about the church or the community committee. Beth Sullivan is still listed as a missing person with no new developments. Emily texts me sometimes, and we both hold on to this thin hope that maybe the investigation will eventually uncover something. But I'm not holding my breath. What keeps me up at night is thinking about how many people might still be trapped in that system, too afraid to leave, or too deep into whatever that organization actually does. I've had nightmares where I'm back in that church basement, where the locked door opens and I see what they were really doing down there. But I always wake up before finding out. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed and fought harder to expose them. But then I remember the look in Deacon Phillips's eyes when he stood at my door, and I know I made the only choice I could. I'm safe now. I have a new job and a new start. But I'll never really feel settled again. I'll always be looking around corners, always wondering if someone from Covenant Fellowship might track me down, because I'm the one who got away and talked to the FBI. That's what they took from me, even though I escaped. They took my ability to ever feel completely safe again, to trust a community, to believe that friendly faces in a small town church are actually what they appear to be. And somewhere in Dalton, Georgia, they're still meeting every other Friday in that basement, still maintaining their structure and ensuring compliance, still making people disappear when they ask too many questions. Everyone wants the full story, but here's the thing, I can't give it to them. The detectives, the therapists, my own parents sitting across from me with those desperate eyes, they all want this clean narrative with a beginning, middle, and end. What I've got instead are these jagged pieces of memory that don't fit together right, like a puzzle someone threw against a wall. What I can tell you is where it started. A Friday night in September, me and 4 friends driving out to some abandoned trailer park off Highway 56 because we were 17 and stupid and thought we were invincible. My buddy Josh had been going on about this place for weeks, saying his older brother told him squatters had turned it into some kind of commune, the kind of place where people went to disappear on purpose, he said, which should have been our first clue to stay the hell away. But when you grow up in a Kansas town where watching wheat grow counts as entertainment, an abandoned trailer park 12 miles outside town sounds like the most interesting thing that's happened all year. I remember climbing into Josh's pickup that night, the 5 of us passing around cheap vodka, laughing about nothing, completely unaware we were driving towards something that would break us all in different ways. The trailer park sat at the end of a dirt road that carved through an old cornfield, the kind that had been left to rot into these tall, dried-out husks that scraped against the truck as we drove through. Someone had spray-painted a crooked arrow on a rusted mailbox where we turned off the highway, pointing us deeper into nowhere. When Josh's headlights finally swept across the clearing, I counted maybe a dozen trailers arranged in this weird circle, most of them sagging on one side or covered in thick vines that made them look like they were being swallowed by the earth. The whole place had this carnival after dark feeling, like something that was supposed to be fun once but had turned into something else entirely. We sat there in the truck for a minute after Josh cut the engine, and that's when I heard it, this low mechanical hum coming from somewhere in the darkness. A generator, I realized, which meant someone was using electricity out here. Amber, Josh's girlfriend, said maybe we should just go, that if people were actually living here we were trespassing, but Josh was already laughing it off. He said anyone squatting in a place like this wasn't going to call the cops on some teenagers. Kevin had his door open before any of us could argue further, flashlight already on, heading toward the nearest trailer like he owned the place. The rest of us followed because that's what you do when you're 17. You follow your friends into the dark, even when every instinct you have is screaming at you to run. The first trailer Kevin approached had its door hanging open, swaying slightly in the wind. He stepped inside and we heard him moving around, his footsteps creaking on what sounded like rotted floorboards. When he came back out, he said it was empty, except for some old furniture and needles scattered everywhere, the kind with the orange caps that you see in documentaries about the opioid crisis. Josh made some joke about junkies and we moved to the next trailer, then the next, finding more of the same. Stripped mattresses, broken glass, that sour smell of mildew and something worse underneath. Stephanie hung back near the truck, her arms wrapped around herself even though it wasn't cold. She kept saying she wanted to leave, that this place felt wrong, but nobody really listened to her. We were too busy trying to act braver than we felt, shining our flashlights into dark corners and daring each other to go deeper into the trailers. It was Josh who noticed the trailer at the far end of the circle looked different from the others. Newer, or at least better maintained. The windows had curtains, actual curtains, not just sheets, and there was a concrete block serving as a front step. No vines growing up the sides. That generator sound was louder near this one, definitely coming from underneath or behind it. Kevin said we should check it out and Josh agreed immediately, like this was some kind of adventure game and we were collecting points. I remember my heart was pounding harder than it should have been, this animal part of my brain sending up warning flares, but I followed anyway because the alternative was standing alone in the dark. We approached the trailer slowly, and that's when I noticed the door wasn't just closed. It had a deadbolt on the outside. A big industrial one, the kind you'd use on a storage unit, installed where someone inside couldn't reach it. Josh touched it and the metal was new. No rust like everything else in this place. Amber asked why anyone would lock a trailer from the outside and nobody had an answer that made sense. Kevin tried the door anyway and it swung open, unlocked, and the smell that came out was like nothing I'd ever experienced. Chemical and sweet at the same time, with this underlying rot that made my eyes water. The inside was dark except for a faint blue glow coming from somewhere in the back. We stood in the doorway, none of us wanting to be the first one to step inside, and that's when we heard it. A sound like fabric dragging across floor, coming from deeper in the trailer. Something or someone was in there with us, moving in the darkness. Josh shined his flashlight toward the sound, and the beam landed on a figure slumped against the far wall, a woman maybe in her 20s or 30s. It was hard to tell. She was staring at us but not really seeing us. Her eyes glassy and unfocused, and her lips were moving like she was talking, but no sound was coming out. She wore a stained tank top, and her arms were covered in track marks, some fresh enough that they still looked angry and red. Kevin started backing up immediately, saying we needed to get out of there, that this was someone's shooting gallery, and we were going to get in serious trouble. But Amber moved forward instead, asking the woman if she was okay, if she needed help. The woman's head lolled to the side, and she made this wet clicking sound in her throat. And I realized she wasn't just high, she was barely conscious, maybe overdosing right in front of us. Stephanie was already running back to the truck, yelling that she was calling 911. But Josh grabbed her and said we couldn't call the cops because we'd been drinking and we'd all get arrested. We were arguing about what to do, our voices getting louder and more panicked, when I heard footsteps outside. Heavy boots on gravel, multiple sets coming from different directions. The generator sound cut out and everything went silent, except for those footsteps getting closer. I don't remember making the decision to hide. My body just moved on its own, pulling me deeper into the trailer, away from the door. Josh and Amber ducked down behind a couch that was leaking stuffing, and Kevin pressed himself against the wall near the bathroom. The woman on the floor didn't react at all, just kept staring at nothing with that slack expression. Then there were voices outside, men's voices, speaking in quick Spanish that I couldn't fully understand. But the tone was clear. They were angry about something. A flashlight beam swept through the open door and someone shouted, asking who was out there, who'd been in their property. The beam landed on Stephanie, who'd only made it halfway to the truck before the lights came on. She stood there like a deer on the highway, caught completely. And I watched through the grimy window as 3 men emerged from between the trailers. They weren't what I expected. No face tattoos or gang colors, just regular-looking guys in work clothes, the kind you'd see at any construction site or farm supply store. One of them had a pistol tucked into his waistband. He walked up to Stephanie and asked her real calm where her friends were. Said he knew she hadn't come alone because he'd seen the truck. She didn't answer. Couldn't answer probably, and he grabbed her arm and started walking her toward the center of the circle, toward the other trailers we hadn't explored yet. That's when Josh made the stupidest decision of his life and ran out after her. He was yelling something about leaving her alone, about how we were just kids and we'd leave and never come back, but his voice cracked halfway through and it just sounded pathetic and desperate. The man with the gun didn't even hesitate. He pulled it out and pointed it at Josh's chest, told him to get on his knees right now or he'd put a hole in him. Josh dropped like his legs had been cut out from under him. Amber started crying next to me, these quiet hiccuping sobs she was trying to muffle with her hand, and I clamped my own hand over her mouth because I knew if they heard us, we were done. Through the window I watched as 2 more men appeared, one of them talking on a cell phone in rapid Spanish, and I caught enough words to understand they were calling someone, asking what to do about the kids who'd found the place. The man on the phone kept saying CC and nodding, and when he hung up, his face looked grim. He walked over to Josh and Stephanie and told them they were going to take a little walk, that if they cooperated, nobody had to get hurt. Josh asked what about his friends in the truck, lying badly, and the man smiled this thin smile and said they'd find them too. Not to worry. They started walking, the 2 of them, toward the far side of the circle, toward trailers I now realized had been modified somehow, with metal reinforcements around the doors and windows that looked like bars. Kevin whispered that we had to run, right now while they were distracted, but I couldn't move. I was watching Josh and Stephanie being led away and my brain was screaming at me to do something, anything, but my body wouldn't respond. Then the woman on the floor behind us started making this horrible keening sound, this animal noise of pure distress, and one of the men heard it. He turned back toward our trailer and started walking, calling out to someone named Luis, saying he needed to check on the girl in number 7. That was us. We were in number 7. Amber bolted first, running out the back window that someone had left partially open, and Kevin went right after her. I should have followed immediately, but I hesitated for maybe 3 seconds, looking at that woman on the floor, who was clearly a prisoner here, clearly someone who needed help. And those 3 seconds cost me everything. The man came through the door just as I was climbing toward the window, and he grabbed my ankle and pulled hard. I hit the floor, and all the air went out of my lungs, and when I looked up, there was a different man standing over me, older than the others, with graying hair and these absolutely dead eyes. He said something in Spanish to the guy holding me, then switched to English and told me I'd made a very big mistake tonight. That they'd been running a good operation here for 2 years without problems, and now They had to figure out what to do with a bunch of nosy kids who couldn't mind their own business. They zip-tied my hands behind my back and walked me to one of the modified trailers, the one with the heaviest bars on the windows. Inside, it was divided into compartments, these small rooms created with plywood walls that didn't reach the ceiling, and I could hear people in the other sections, breathing, shifting, someone crying softly. They shoved me into one of these rooms and the door had a padlock on the outside, just like that first trailer. The space was maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, with a thin mattress on the floor and a bucket in the corner that I didn't want to think about. There was sound insulation stapled to the walls, the kind you see in recording studios, which explained why nobody outside had ever heard anything from this place. Josh was in the compartment next to mine. I could hear him through the thin plywood, asking if I was okay, his voice shaking. Stephanie was somewhere further down, calling out for Amber and Kevin, begging them to get help. One of the men banged on the wall and told us to shut up or he'd give us something to really cry about. The hours that followed are the blurriest part of my memory. I know we were kept in those rooms while they decided what to do with us. I know they brought us water and these protein bars that tasted like cardboard, keeping us alive but barely. I know Josh tried to kick his door down at some point and they came in and beat him badly enough that he stopped making noise for a long time. What I learned later, after everything, was that Amber and Kevin had made it back to the highway. They'd run through that cornfield in complete darkness, getting cut up by the dried stalks, and flagged down a semi-truck around 3 in the morning. The driver let them use his CB radio to call for help, and they told the police everything. The trailer park, the men with guns, their 3 friends who'd been taken. But here's the thing about Kansas County police departments at 3 in the morning. They're understaffed and skeptical, especially when 2 drunk teenagers show up with a story about armed men and kidnapping in an abandoned trailer park that most locals didn't even know existed. The officer who responded thought they were either pulling a prank or had gotten into some kind of drug deal gone wrong. He drove out to Highway 56 with them at dawn, but couldn't find the turnoff they described. That spray-painted arrow on the mailbox was gone, painted over with brown that matched the rust. The dirt road through the cornfield had been smoothed out somehow, and without that clear path, the officer didn't want to drive his cruiser through private farmland on the word of 2 scared kids who couldn't give him an exact location. He took a report and told them he'd follow up, but Amber said she could tell he didn't believe them. It took 3 days and both sets of parents raising hell before the sheriff's department organized a real search, and by then we'd been moved. They transported us at night in a panel van with no windows, drove for what felt like hours on roads that went from paved to gravel to dirt. When they finally let us out, we were at a different location entirely, some kind of warehouse or industrial building that smelled like chemicals and had these huge ventilation fans running constantly. The operation was bigger than I'd understood. There were maybe 20 other people being held there, ranging from teenagers to people in their 40s, all in various states of withdrawal or sedation. I realized we'd stumbled into something way beyond a local drug operation. They were using people as mules, as labor, as leverage against family members who owed money. The man with the dead eyes, the one who seemed to be in charge, told us we'd work off our debt for trespassing and causing problems. He said we'd ruined a good setup and cost them money and having to relocate, so now we owed them. Josh kept insisting we were just kids, that our parents would pay whatever they wanted, but the man laughed and said our parents couldn't pay what we'd cost them. For weeks, maybe months, time stopped meaning anything in that place. We sorted pills, packaged powder into baggies, loaded and unloaded trucks that came in the middle of the night. They kept us compliant with just enough food to function and occasional doses of something that made everything feel far away and unimportant. Stephanie stopped talking after the first week. Josh tried to escape once and they broke 3 of his fingers as a lesson to the rest of us. The fragmented memories I have are mostly from this period. Days blending together. The constant noise of those ventilation fans, the chemical taste in my mouth that never went away. But I also remember the moment everything changed. A woman showed up one day, someone new they'd brought in, And she was different from the rest of us. She wasn't scared. She was angry, loudly, violently angry, screaming at the guards about a lawyer and her husband, and how people knew where she was. They tried to shut her up, but she wouldn't stop. And I think that's what finally brought attention to the place. Because 3 days after she arrived, I woke up to the sound of doors being smashed in and men in tactical gear yelling for everyone to get on the ground. Federal agents, it turned out, DEA and FBI. They'd been investigating the drug ring for over a year, but couldn't find their main distribution center until this woman, a county prosecutor's wife who'd been grabbed by mistake, a case of mistaken identity, went missing, and her husband tore apart every lead with resources we never had. They raided 4 locations simultaneously that morning in January, recovered 37 people total, and arrested 23 men connected to an operation that stretched from the Midwest to the East Coast. Josh, Stephanie, and I were separated immediately, taken to different hospitals, debriefed by so many different agencies that their faces all blur together now. My parents cried when they saw me, and I couldn't cry back. I'd forgotten how, somewhere in those months. The worst part was learning that Kevin had died 2 weeks after escaping. Carbon monoxide poisoning in his garage, his truck running, officially ruled an accident, but everyone who knew him understood what it really was. The guilt of leaving us behind had eaten him alive. They tell me I should feel lucky to be alive, that most people in situations like ours don't come home at all. The prosecutors used our testimony to put away the main operators for life, and the FBI shut down the entire network. That trailer park off Highway 56 was bulldozed within a month of our rescue. The whole area fenced off and turned into nothing, like it never existed at all. Josh moved to Colorado with his family right after the trials ended. I heard he's doing better now, working at a ski resort, trying to build a normal life. Stephanie's in intensive therapy somewhere on the East Coast. Her parents won't say where exactly. Amber finished high school online and left town the day she turned 18. I stayed because running felt like letting them win, even though I see that warehouse every time I close my eyes and smell those chemicals every time it rains. My high school graduating class walked in 2014 and I wasn't there. I was still doing physical therapy, still trying to remember how to be a person instead of just a body that follows orders. Sometimes people recognize me around town, the kid who survived that thing with the drug trailers, and they get this look like they want to ask questions but don't know how. I don't blame them. I wouldn't know what to ask either. The detectives say my fragmented memory is normal for trauma, that pieces might come back or they might not, and I should focus on moving forward instead of trying to reconstruct everything. But here's what I know for certain. There are more places like that warehouse out there. More operations running right now in spaces people drive past every day without noticing. And there are still people in those places, waiting for someone to stumble across them the way we did, hoping their luck turns out better than ours. My cousin Rita had this way of making everything seem fixable, even when it wasn't. Wednesday evening in January 2024, I sat at her kitchen table just outside Springfield, Missouri, signing papers that ended my marriage while she heated up leftover pot roast and told me about her plans for spring planting. My birthday had passed the week before. 39 felt different than 38 somehow, heavier. And here I was starting from scratch with a new apartment in town, and a job that kept me staring at wrecked cars all day. Insurance adjusting pays decent, but it teaches you to see damage everywhere, calculate loss like it's just numbers on a form. Rita kept the conversation light, asked about work, avoided mentioning my ex-wife's name. By the time I left around 7, the sun had already set, leaving that dead gray light that makes Missouri winter feel twice as cold. County Road 48 was my usual route home, 40 minutes of farmland and scattered houses set so far back from the road you could barely see them. I'd driven it 100 times, knew every curve and dip. Around mile marker 31, my 2015 Ford F-150 started making this grinding noise that shot straight through the floorboard. The engine shuddered hard, the whole truck vibrated, and then everything just quit. I managed to coast onto the shoulder near a beaten mailbox with Pruitt spray-painted crooked across the front. Tried the ignition 3 times, got nothing but clicking and that horrible metal-on-metal sound. One car passed without slowing, taillights vanishing around the bend like it couldn't get away fast enough. I pulled out my phone, saw 2 bars of signal, and searched for a tow truck. Most of the big companies showed wait times over an hour. Then I found Anchor Towing. Local number, promised 15-minute response, available all hours. I called, and a man answered so fast I barely heard it ring, his voice gravelly and worn, like he'd been waiting by the phone. He asked where I was, and I told him County Road 48, near the Pruitt mailbox at mile marker 31. He didn't ask for more details, didn't need the make and model of my truck, nothing about what was wrong with it. Just said, "Yeah, I know where that is. Be there in 10, and hung up before I could even say thanks. The whole call lasted maybe 20 seconds. I sat there in the cab, heater still blowing cold air because the engine was dead, and realized I hadn't asked about the price or what shop he was taking me to. But honestly, I just wanted to get home, peel off these clothes that still smelled like Rita's kitchen, and sleep for about 12 hours straight. The road stayed empty. No headlights in either direction, just the wind pushing dead leaves across the asphalt, and the distant shape of a barn I could barely make out against the darkening sky. Then, headlights appeared from the direction I'd come, moving fast. Way faster than you'd expect a tow truck to move, especially on a road like this with all its turns. The lights swept around the bend, and I could see it wasn't one of those big professional rigs with the company name plastered across the side in bright letters. It was a Chevy Silverado, maybe early 2000s, dark blue or black, hard to tell in the fading light. It had a tow bar welded to the back, and one of those yellow rotating beacons on the roof. The kind you can buy at any auto parts store and stick on with a magnet. On the driver's door was a decal, Anchor Towing, with an anchor symbol and a phone number, but it looked homemade, like someone had printed it on their computer and stuck it on with adhesive. The truck pulled up behind mine and the driver got out, leaving his headlights on so they lit up the whole scene in harsh white light that made everything look strange and flat. The guy who stepped out was tall, maybe 6'2", wearing a stained Carhartt jacket and jeans that had seen better days. His face was hard to make out with the headlights behind him, but I could see he was older, probably in his 50s, with a gray beard that needed trimming and a baseball cap pulled low. He walked up to my window, and I rolled it down, cold air rushing in. He smelled like cigarettes and motor oil, that combination every mechanic seems to carry around like cologne. "Engine's done, huh?" he said, not really asking. His voice was the same one from the phone, rough and flat, no warmth in it. I nodded and explained the grinding noise, how everything just died, and he listened without looking at me, his eyes scanning my truck like he was appraising it. When I finished talking, he just said, "I'll hook you up, take you to my shop. It's about 20 minutes from here, just off Highway 12. He didn't mention a price, didn't ask if I wanted to call anyone, didn't hand me a business card or a form to sign. He worked fast, moving around to the back of my truck with a chain that clanked loud in the quiet. I got out to watch, mostly because sitting in the cab doing nothing made me feel useless, and also because some part of me, the part that spends all day documenting accident scenes, wanted to see how he was rigging it up. The setup looked solid enough, chains looped through the frame, hooks secured, but there was something sloppy about it, like he'd done this 1,000 times and stopped caring about the details. He worked without talking, didn't make small talk about the weather or ask what I did for a living, none of that casual conversation tow truck drivers usually throw at you to fill the silence. When he finished, he straightened up and said, "You can ride with me or stay in your truck, doesn't matter." His tone made it clear he didn't care either way. I hesitated, looking between his Silverado and my F-150. and something in my gut twitched. Just a small, uncomfortable feeling I couldn't name. But I was tired, emotionally wrung out, and this guy was my ride. I told him I'd stay in my truck. He shrugged like I'd just told him the sky was blue and walked back to his Silverado without another word. I climbed into my F-150, settled into the driver's seat even though I had no control anymore, and watched through the rear window as he got into his truck. The engine rumbled to life, louder than it should have been, and then we started moving. The jerk when we first pulled onto the road was rough, rattled my teeth, but then it smoothed out into this weird gliding feeling, being pulled along by someone else's momentum. I kept my phone in my hand, screen lit up showing 7:30, and watched the road slide past in reverse through my side mirror. We went maybe 2 miles before he made a turn I didn't recognize, onto a narrower road with no street sign, just gravel and dirt packed hard from years of use. Trees pressed in close on both sides, branches scraping the top of my truck with this rhythmic scratching sound that set my nerves on edge. That's when I realized I had no idea where this shop was supposed to be. He'd said Highway 12, but we were heading away from it, deeper into back roads I'd never been on. I tried to remember if there were any repair shops out this way and came up blank. My phone still had 1 bar of signal, just barely hanging on. I thought about calling Rita, telling her where I was, but what would I even say? That I had a bad feeling about the tow truck driver who was doing exactly what I'd paid him to do. That sounded paranoid, like the stress of the day was making me see danger where there wasn't any. But my hands wouldn't stop gripping the phone tighter, and I kept watching the trees pass by, looking for something familiar, some landmark that would tell me we were going the right direction. Nothing. Just more trees, more darkness, and that horrible scratching sound every time a branch dragged across my roof. Then he turned again, onto an even smaller road, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles, and the pavement gave way entirely to dirt. The beacon on his roof kept spinning, throwing yellow light across the trees in sick rotating patterns. We'd been driving for maybe 15 minutes when he slowed down near a clearing on the left side of the road. Through the windshield, I could see the outline of a structure, maybe a shed or a small building, set back about 30 feet from the road. No lights on inside, no sign, nothing that looked like a legitimate repair shop. Just a dark shape against darker trees. My entire body went rigid. This wasn't right. None of this was right. He pulled to a stop and the Silverado's engine kept running, that rough idle vibrating through the chains into my truck. I watched him in the side mirror, saw him open his door and step out, moving toward the back where the chains were connected. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to do something, but I was hooked to his truck, couldn't drive away even if my engine worked. My phone showed no signal now, just an empty bar mocking me in the corner of the screen. I locked my doors, stupid, pointless, but it was all I could think to do. He appeared at my window, standing there in the yellow rotating light, and tapped on the glass with his knuckle. Not aggressive, just a casual tap, like he had all the time in the world. I didn't roll it down. Through the glass, I could see his face clearly now, and there was something empty in his expression, mechanical, like he was going through motions he'd rehearsed. He said something I couldn't hear through the window, gestured toward the building. I shook my head, held up my phone, pointed at the screen showing no signal, then made a gesture like I was calling someone. Universal sign for, I'm not getting out. I have people who know where I am. Complete lie, but I sold it hard. His face didn't change. He stood there for what felt like 10 minutes but was probably 30 seconds, just staring at me through the glass. Then he did something I wasn't expecting. He pulled out his own phone, looked at it, put it back in his pocket and walked back to his truck without saying another word. I heard his door slam and then nothing happened. We just sat there, his engine running, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then headlights appeared behind us, coming up the dirt road fast. A vehicle rounded the bend, high beams cutting through the darkness, and I've never been so relieved to see another human being in my entire life. It was a patrol car, county sheriff, and it pulled up maybe 20 feet behind the Silverado with its lights going. A deputy got out, flashlight in hand, and walked up to the driver's side of the tow truck. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see the deputy's posture change, see him step back and put his hand near his belt. The conversation lasted maybe 2 minutes, and then the deputy walked over to my window. I rolled it down immediately, cold air rushing in along with the sound of the deputy's radio crackling. He was young, maybe late 20s, with a clean-shaved face and sharp eyes that took in everything. "Sir, are you all right?" he asked, and his voice had that careful calm cops use when they think something's wrong, but don't want to spook anyone. I told him I'd called for a tow. My truck broke down on County Road 48, and this guy showed up saying he'd take me to his shop. The deputy nodded slowly, glanced back at the Silverado, then asked me, "Did you get a card or any paperwork from him?" I said no, and his jaw tightened just slightly. The deputy told me to stay put and walked back to the Silverado. Whatever he said to the driver made the guy get out of his truck with his hands visible, and within minutes another patrol car showed up, then another. They had the driver standing by the hood of his Silverado, talking to him, checking his identification, running something on their radios. One of the deputies came over and explained they'd been looking for this guy for 3 weeks. Apparently there'd been a string of incidents, people calling for tow trucks on rural roads, drivers showing up fast with homemade decals and no legitimate business license, then either robbing the stranded motorists or, in 2 cases, the people in their vehicles just vanished entirely until their trucks were found abandoned days later in different counties. The fake tow driver would target people alone on empty roads, use the isolation against them, and the decal on his door could peel right off when he was done. They'd been tracking reports but couldn't pin him down until tonight. The deputy said the only reason they found me was because someone had called in a suspicious vehicle, matching the description heading down this road. Probably a neighbor who'd seen the beacon light through the trees and thought it was strange. They unhooked my truck right there on the dirt road and called a legitimate towing company out of Springfield to come get me. Took another hour before they arrived, and I spent that time sitting in the back of a patrol car with a blanket around my shoulders, watching them process the scene. The building in the clearing turned out to be an abandoned hunting cabin. Nothing inside but some old furniture and evidence of other people having been there recently. Rope, duct tape, a toolbox. The deputy who'd found me said I'd gotten lucky in ways I probably didn't fully understand yet, that staying in my truck and refusing to get out had likely saved my life. When the real tow truck finally showed up, a bright red rig with the company name in huge letters and a driver who had paperwork and a business card, and asked me a dozen questions about my insurance, I felt like I could breathe again. They took me and my F-150 to a shop in town, and I called Rita from there around midnight to tell her what happened. She cried, which made me realize how close I'd actually come to not making that call at all. The guy they arrested turned out to have a record: assault, theft, a bunch of other charges going back years. I had to give a statement to the police, went through the whole thing again in detail, and they told me I'd probably have to testify if it went to trial. I said I would, absolutely, whatever they needed. That was 3 months ago now, and I still won't drive County Road 48 at night. Still check the credentials of any service person before they touch my vehicle. Still get a knot in my chest when I see a tow truck beacon spinning in the dark. Some guy in a fake uniform with a homemade decal almost made me disappear, and the only reason I'm here typing this is because I listened to that small, uncomfortable feeling in my gut and refused to get out of my truck. Trust that feeling. Always. Folks around our town always said the bridge at Mason Creek had a bad feeling to it. It sits about 3 miles past the diner where I work, tucked behind a patch of pine trees and fog that never really lifts. The asphalt there crumbles into dirt, and when the wind blows through, it whistles through the cracks like the bridge is breathing. I had lived in Claymore all my life, waiting tables since I was 18, and I knew every regular's car by sight. That is why, when I drove home after my shift one night and saw a silver Honda parked near the guardrail with no lights on, it caught my attention immediately. At first, I figured someone broke down. Happens all the time when folks take the back roads to avoid the state patrol. But when I passed by the next night and saw a different car in almost the same spot, an old maroon Buick this time, I felt a strange sense of repetition that stuck with me. People in town started whispering about it too. A delivery guy said he'd seen 3 cars left there in the last week, always after midnight, always gone by morning. Nobody knew who they belonged to, and nobody really wanted to stop and check. Then came the night I noticed a beat-up blue Ford Fusion parked right under the bridge's main arch. I recognized it right away. It belonged to Casey, one of the waitresses who worked the late shift with me at the diner. Casey had been covering extra hours because her boyfriend lost his job, and she usually left around the same time I did. Seeing her car sitting there, engine off, door slightly cracked open, made my chest tighten in a way I can't fully describe. I pulled over a little ahead of the bridge, cut the headlights, and just sat there, watching the Ford. The whole place was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. The bridge lights had gone out years ago, so the only thing I could see was the faint gleam of metal from the car's bumper catching my high beams. I called Casey's phone, no answer. Tried again, nothing. That was when I noticed a faint flicker of light inside her car, like someone using a flashlight or maybe a lighter. It blinked twice, then disappeared. For a few seconds I thought about turning around and pretending I never saw it. But curiosity has always been my worst habit. I stepped out of my car, leaving the engine idling just in case I needed to bolt. The air smelled like wet iron, sharp and heavy. My shoes crunched against the gravel as I moved closer to Casey's car, calling her name softly. No answer. I peeked through the driver's window and saw her purse still on the seat, her phone face down beside it, the screen cracked. But the back seat was empty. That small light I'd seen earlier wasn't there anymore, and the silence felt deeper, as if the woods had stopped breathing too. Something about that bridge always messed with radios, but I had my work walkie-talkie in my apron pocket from the diner. It wasn't meant for long distance, yet a faint voice came through when I turned it on. Static first, then a man's voice. Steady, low, like he was talking right next to my ear. "You out here too?" he said. I froze in place, listening. The signal hissed, then he spoke again. "Bridge is quiet tonight, just the way I like it." His tone was calm, almost conversational, which somehow made it worse. I backed away from the car, keeping my eyes on the dark stretch of bridge ahead. There were faint tire marks near the guardrail, fresh ones that hadn't been there before. That was when I heard it. The slow grind of a diesel engine starting somewhere beyond the trees. The kind of deep rumble you feel in your ribs. The sound echoed under the bridge, bouncing around like it had nowhere else to go. I crouched behind Casey's car, heart hammering, and watched as a semi-truck's headlights blinked on in the distance. It crept forward like it was stalking something. The driver never used the horn, never flashed the brights, just rolled closer until the grille reflected in the water beneath the bridge. I caught a glimpse of the trailer's paint, dull red with peeling white letters that might have once spelled a company name. I remember thinking that whoever was behind that wheel wasn't just passing through. They were waiting. The truck stopped in the middle of the bridge, its headlights dimmed, leaving everything bathed in weak moonlight. A voice crackled through my walkie again. Same man, same calm tone. "She came out to meet me, you know. Said she heard me calling." My chest tightened. Casey had told me once she liked to listen to old CB channels while closing up the diner. Said they made the drive home less lonely. The man kept talking, describing her hair, her voice, how she sounded scared when she realized there was no signal down here. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move fast enough. Then the truck's door opened. I could see the driver's outline against the cab light, broad shoulders, baseball cap, face hidden by shadow. He leaned out and tossed something over the bridge rail. It hit the water with a soft splash. I felt my throat close up. The radio clicked again, quieter now. Sometimes they answer, sometimes they don't. His engine roared back to life, and the truck rolled off into the trees, taillights fading until the night swallowed them whole. I didn't go to the police until morning. When they checked the bridge, they found Casey's phone, the same one I'd seen in her car, shattered near the guardrail. They said the signal from her last call had bounced off an unregistered frequency, one the highway patrol hadn't used in decades. A few weeks later, they traced similar disappearances to truck stops along the interstate, each near a bridge, each victim last heard talking on CB channels no one was supposed to be using anymore. To this day, that stretch of road stays empty after dark. People in Claymore say it's haunted, but I don't think it's ghosts keeping folks away. Sometimes late at night, the diner's radio picks up faint chatter from a channel that shouldn't exist. Just a man's voice, clear as if he's sitting at the counter. "Anyone out there near the bridge?" he says. "It's real quiet tonight." Classes had been exhausting that semester, and I was desperate for a quiet weekend to make some money. When my roommate mentioned a family who needed a babysitter for 2 nights, it felt like a perfect break from the campus chaos. The family lived in a tidy 2-story house on the edge of a small Oregon town. Quiet, tree-lined streets where everyone seemed to know each other. The mother, Erin, met me at the door with the kind of warmth that felt practiced, but not unkind. Her husband, Patrick, was supposedly leaving that evening for a business trip to Portland, and the 2 kids, Max and Lily, were already in their pajamas when I arrived. Erin gave me a quick tour of the house, moving a little too fast through each room, pointing out the snacks, the camera monitors, the back door, the alarm code. She kept saying how much she appreciated me coming on short notice. Her voice trembled just slightly when she mentioned Patrick's trip, but I brushed it off as exhaustion. Before she left, she kissed both kids on the forehead, reminded me not to open the door for anyone, and promised to be back by late morning. When the door clicked shut, the silence in that big house felt heavier than it should have. The night started out fine. Max and Lily were good kids, restless but polite. We played a board game, watched an old animated movie, and they fell asleep by 9. After cleaning up the living room, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea, scrolling through my phone, while the soft hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. The only light came from the little night bulb over the sink, making everything look faded and distant. The house felt peaceful, almost too still, like it was waiting for something. Around midnight, the first knock came. 3 dull taps on the back door, slow and deliberate. I figured it might be a neighbor, someone who had noticed Erin's car gone and wanted to check in. Still, something in the rhythm of those knocks made me hesitate. I opened the kitchen tablet to check the porch camera. The grainy feed lit up, and I swear my breath caught when I saw the man on the screen. Patrick, standing there in the cold, his face lit by the porch light. At first I thought maybe the trip had been canceled, but something about the way he stood there, completely still, staring straight into the camera, made my throat tighten. He wasn't knocking anymore, just standing in the same position, his hands at his sides. The porch light flickered once, and the feed glitched for half a second. When it came back, he was gone. I remember walking to the door and checking the lock twice before stepping back and texting Erin. No answer. Then I called her. Straight to voicemail. A few minutes later, a soft scratching sound came from the side of the house, like branches scraping the siding, except there were no trees close enough for that. I turned off the kitchen light to get a clearer view through the window. Outside, the yard looked empty. The swing set in the corner moved slightly, just enough to catch the light. I could not tell if it was the wind or something else. I told myself I was being paranoid. Still, I grabbed the house phone. Yes, an actual landline, and kept it next to me. When the knocks started again, they were louder, faster. The kids upstairs began to stir. I heard Max's small voice call out, asking if everything was okay. I lied and told him it was just a neighbor. My voice must have sounded wrong because he came to the top of the stairs, clutching a blanket. I told him to stay with his sister, locked the kitchen door again, and turned the deadbolt twice. Then I checked the camera feed one more time. Patrick was back. His face was closer now, his expression flat, as if he were watching something beyond the lens. I dialed 911 with shaking fingers, whispering the address while keeping my eyes on the screen. The dispatcher asked me if I was sure it was the homeowner. I said yes, absolutely sure. She told me officers were on their way and to stay inside. I remember feeling this strange mixture of relief and disbelief. I had seen his face earlier that evening when he hugged the kids goodbye. There was no mistaking him, but the man on that screen looked wrong somehow. The same features, same clothes, but a blankness in his eyes that I can't describe. The police took about 15 minutes to arrive, though it felt much longer. During that time, I kept every light in the house off and sat at the bottom of the stairs listening. I could hear something faint outside, footsteps crunching against the gravel, slow and uneven. Then the sound of a car door shutting somewhere nearby. I waited for a knock at the front door, but it never came. When red and blue lights finally flashed through the curtains, I ran to open the door before they even stepped out of the car. 2 officers searched the property while one stayed with me and the kids. They found footprints near the back porch, leading toward the woods that bordered the neighborhood. I remember one of them saying the prints matched heavy boots, not sneakers or dress shoes. When they ran Patrick's name through their system, the mood shifted instantly. One of the officers made a quick call and stepped outside. A few minutes later, he came back pale-faced and told me Patrick was confirmed to be in Portland. His body had been found in a motel parking lot earlier that evening. Aaron returned the next morning in tears, escorted by detectives. The truth unfolded in fragments. Months of violence hidden behind closed doors, reports she never filed, neighbors who suspected but stayed quiet. Patrick had apparently left town 2 days earlier after a violent argument, but something or someone wearing his face came back that night. The officers never found any signs of forced entry, and the camera feed from that moment somehow vanished from the cloud storage before they could retrieve it. I quit babysitting after that. Aaron and the kids moved away not long later. Every once in a while, I'll see a man on the street with the same posture, the same way of standing perfectly still like Patrick did on that porch. And for a second, I feel that same pressure in my chest, like the air is too thick. I try not to think about what I saw on that screen, or who, if anyone, was actually standing outside that door. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The October wind cut through the pines differently up here, carrying that sharp mountain cold that reminds you just how far from civilization you really are. I'd driven out to test some new gear I'd picked up over the summer, a lightweight hammock system, water purification tablets, the whole setup that outdoor magazines swear will change your life. My divorce had finalized 8 months earlier, right around my 37th birthday, and I'd been pouring money into hobbies ever since. The trailhead parking area had been empty except for my Subaru and an old pickup truck with rust eating through the wheel wells. 20 miles of dirt road between me and the nearest paved highway, another 40 to the closest town worth mentioning. Perfect conditions for what I needed. Absolute solitude to figure out if I could still handle being alone with myself. I'd made good progress that first day, pushing about 15 miles into the backcountry before setting up camp near a creek bend where the water ran clear over granite stones. The spot had everything. Flat ground for the tent I'd brought as backup, trees spaced right for the hammock, fresh water nearby. I spent the afternoon organizing gear, taking notes on what worked and what didn't, feeling that satisfaction of self-sufficiency settling into my bones. Around sunset, I'd hiked a quarter-mile upstream to filter water for dinner and breakfast, leaving my camp to gather firewood on the way back. The freeze-dried pad thai actually tasted decent after a day of trail mix and jerky. I remember sitting by the fire, watching sparks rise into the darkness, thinking maybe I'd finally turned a corner on the whole starting over thing. The first sign happened when I went to hang my food bag. Every backpacker knows the drill. String it up high between trees, keep the bears from getting interested. I'd picked 2 pines about 30 feet from where I'd built the fire, and that's when I saw them. Boot prints in the soft dirt around my hammock setup, pressed deep like someone had stood there for a while. Not mine. I wear size 11 Merrells with a distinctive tread pattern I'd recognize anywhere. These were smaller, maybe size 9, with a heel pattern that looked almost military. The prints circled my entire camp area, pausing at my pack, my hammock, the spot where I'd stacked my firewood. My chest tightened as I followed the trail with my headlamp. Whoever made these had been here while I was upstream getting water, walking through my space, touching my things maybe, learning my setup. But the rocks were what really got under my skin. 3 of them, each about the size of a softball, arranged in a perfect triangle near the base of the tree where I'd leaned my trekking poles. They weren't randomly scattered. Someone had deliberately placed them there, points aligned precisely north-southeast. I found another arrangement 20 yards out, this time 4 rocks in a square with a 5th one dead center. Then another past that, and another. They formed a rough perimeter around my camp, maybe 8 or 9 of these little formations total. Some kind of marking system, had to be. I stood there in the dark, headlamp beam cutting through the trees, trying to convince myself that maybe day hikers had come through. Maybe it was some geocaching thing. Maybe anything except what my gut was screaming. That someone had been watching me set up camp, cataloging my equipment, and leaving these markers for a reason I didn't understand. I pulled out my phone, hoping for even 1 bar of signal to call for advice. Maybe check if there were any warnings about the area. Nothing. The screen showed emergency calls only, and even that was questionable this deep in the mountains. The nearest cell tower was probably 60 miles away. I spent the next hour breaking down the rock formations, scattering them into the underbrush, trying to reclaim some sense of control over the situation. Packed everything valuable into my sleeping area, rigged a few empty cans on paracord as makeshift alarms around the perimeter. The kind of thing that seems clever when you're desperate but probably wouldn't stop anyone who really wanted to get close. I lay in my hammock fully clothed, boots still on, knife clipped to my belt, telling myself I was overreacting. Sleep came in fragments, never deeper than that surface level where every sound jolts you awake. A branch cracking somewhere to the east, wind through the pines that sounded too rhythmic, too much like breathing. Around what my watch said was 2 in the morning, I heard something that made me sit up completely. A barred owl call, perfect in its execution, except barred owls don't live this far west. They're an eastern species. Their range stops hundreds of miles from here. I know birds. Spent 2 summers volunteering with the Audubon Society after college. Whoever made that call knew exactly what they were doing. Probably learned it from YouTube or one of those hunting apps. They were signaling to someone or testing if I'd respond, or just letting me know they were out there. The call came again 5 minutes later, closer this time, from the north side of my camp where the trees grew thicker. I slipped out of the hammock, moving as quietly as I could manage in hiking boots on dried pine needles. The knife felt pathetically small in my hand, a 4-inch folding blade meant for cutting rope and opening packages, not for whatever this was becoming. I crouched behind a thick Douglas fir and waited, controlling my breathing, listening for movement. Then came a coyote yip from the west, high and keening, except it had that same manufactured quality as the owl call. Too precise, too practiced. They were triangulating my position using animal sounds, probably 2 of them, maybe 3. Classic hunting technique. Use calls to communicate without seeming human. Make your prey think they're surrounded by wildlife instead of people. My mouth went dry as I realized how much planning this took. These weren't random hikers who'd stumbled onto my camp. They'd probably seen my car at the trailhead, followed me all day at a distance, waited for dark. The next sound made my decision for me. Footsteps, deliberate and unhurried, crunching through the understory about 40 yards south. Not trying to be silent anymore, wanting me to hear them approach, I grabbed my pack, left everything else, the hammock, the tent, the cooking gear, all of it, and started moving north, away from the footsteps, deeper into the forest. No headlamp, navigating by moonlight and memory, trying to put distance between myself and whatever sick game these people were playing. Behind me, I heard my camp alarm trip, the cans rattling against each other. Then silence. Then laughter, low and appreciative, like someone admiring a child's attempt at being clever. They weren't chasing me yet. They were going through my abandoned gear, learning more about me, deciding how this would go. I moved through the forest for what must have been an hour, staying near the creek for navigation but far enough away that the water noise wouldn't mask approaching footsteps. Every 50 yards or so I'd stop, crouch, listen. Nothing at first. Then maybe 30 minutes into my escape I heard it. A whistle, long and low, somewhere behind me to the east. An answering whistle came from the west, different pitch, different person. They were flanking me, keeping pace, letting me know they knew exactly where I was. The terror of it was how patient they were. No running, no shouting, just this steady, methodical pursuit. Like they'd done this before. Like they knew exactly how long it took for fear to break someone down, make them sloppy, make them fall or panic, or do something stupid that would end this little chase. My legs were burning by the time I reached a section of deadfall. Massive trees blown down in some old storm, creating a maze of trunk and branches 15 feet high in places. I crawled into the tangle, finding a hollow beneath two crossed logs where I could hide and catch my breath. Pulled out my phone again. Still nothing. Battery at 60%. I turned it off to save power, then remembered the GPS function would work without signal. Turned it back on, marked my location, tried to figure out the fastest route back to the trailhead. 20 miles of wilderness. But if I pushed hard, stayed off trail, maybe I could make it by noon. That's when I saw the text message notification. 1 bar of signal, barely registering. The message was from an unknown number, received an hour ago when I must have passed through a pocket of coverage. Nice gear, the hammock especially. We'll take good care of it after you're gone. My throat closed up. They had my phone number. They'd been close enough to see the brand of my hammock maybe while I was setting it up, thinking I was alone. Another whistle. Closer now. Maybe 200 yards. They were tightening the circle. Scrambled out of the deadfall and kept moving, following the creek downstream, knowing it would eventually lead to the valley where I'd parked. The moon was setting, darkness thickening under the canopy. I stumbled over roots, scraped my palms on bark, kept going. Then I heard something that changed everything, a dog barking, that deep, purposeful bay of a hunting hound catching scent. Of course they had dogs. This was their territory, their game. They probably lived in one of those little mountain towns, the kind where everyone knows everyone, and outsiders are tolerated only as long as they keep passing through. The barking got louder, more excited. The dog had found my trail from the camp. I had maybe 10 minutes before it caught up. No way to outrun a dog in this terrain, not with 15 miles still to cover. I made the choice that probably saved my life. Instead of running, I doubled back toward my abandoned camp, moving perpendicular to my original trail, wading through the creek to break the scent line. Let them think I was still fleeing north while I circled back. I found my camp destroyed, gear scattered and torn apart, my expensive hammock shredded into ribbons and hung from branches like party streamers. But they'd left my car keys. I'd hidden them separately in a zippered pocket they must have missed. I grabbed them and a water bottle, then heard voices approaching from the north. Casual conversation like they were on a morning hike. The dog was with them, leashed now, whining with frustration at losing the trail. I belly crawled into thick undergrowth and waited, breathing through my nose, watching their headlamps sweep the clearing. 3 of them, all men, dressed in hunting camo. One had a crossbow. They stood in my destroyed camp for maybe 5 minutes, discussing whether to wait for me to circle back or keep pushing north. The older one, gray beard visible in the lamplight, finally said I was probably smarter than the last one. Might make it interesting. They left heading northwest, taking their time, confident they'd pick up my trail again soon. I waited another 20 minutes after their voices faded, then started the most careful, quiet journey of my life. Stayed off the main trail, paralleling it through the brush, stopping every 100 yards to listen. The sky was starting to lighten in the east when I heard the dog again, baying excitedly from somewhere up the mountain. They'd found where I doubled back, realized my trick. But I had a 2-hour head start now, and desperation making me fast. I half ran, half stumbled those final 8 miles, branches tearing at my clothes, pack bouncing against my spine. Reached a ridge where I could see down into the valley, and there it was, the dirt road. My Subaru still parked alone at the trailhead. No other vehicles. They must have been dropped off, planning to take their time with me, maybe drive my car out themselves when they were done. I practically fell down the last slope, key already in my hand, threw myself into the driver's seat and locked the doors. Engine turned over on the first try. I drove those 20 miles of dirt road faster than was safe, fishtailing around curves, gravel pinging off the undercarriage. Made it to the highway as full daylight broke through the trees. Drove straight through to the state police station in the nearest real town, walked in looking like hell. Clothes torn, covered in dirt and dried sweat. The officer at the desk, a young woman with kind eyes, took one look at me and got her sergeant. I told them everything, showed them the text message, the photos I'd managed to take of the boot prints before deleting them in panic. They sent 2 units up to check the trailhead, found nothing but my destroyed gear scattered in the woods. No prints except mine, no trace of the men or the dog. The message on my phone had somehow deleted itself, showing nothing in my inbox. The sergeant suggested maybe I'd had a wildlife encounter, gotten spooked, torn up my own gear in the dark. Panic does strange things to people, he said. But he took my report anyway, filed it under suspicious activity. I never went back to get my gear, wrote it off as a loss, sold my camping equipment online the next month. Started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma, though I never told her the whole truth, just said I'd had a bad experience hiking alone. 6 weeks later, I was grabbing coffee in town when I overheard 2 guys at the next table talking about some hiker who'd gone missing up in those same mountains. Different trailhead, they said, but same general area. They found his car but never found him. The search had been called off after a week. I left my coffee untouched, walked out on shaking legs, sat in my car for an hour trying to decide if I should go back to the police. But what would I tell them that I hadn't already said? That I'd overheard a conversation about a missing person in the same area where I'd claimed to be hunted? They already thought I'd imagined it all. I drove home, looked up the missing hiker online. His name was Robert, 43, recently divorced, had just gotten into solo backpacking. The parallels made me sick. I still check the news for missing hikers in that area, still jump when I hear whistling in public, still can't shake the feeling that somewhere in those mountains, those 3 men are preparing for the next one who thinks the wilderness is empty. The flyers were everywhere that Saturday morning in early June, when I stopped for coffee at the gas station near Cedar Ridge Park. A 7-year-old girl named Mia had wandered off from her family's campsite 3 days earlier, and the whole town had mobilized to find her. I'd just turned 31 that spring, no kids of my own yet, but seeing that little face with the gap-toothed smile made my chest tight. The volunteer coordinator at the fire station barely glanced at my driver's license before handing me an orange vest and assigning me to Search Team 4. We'd be covering the northeastern section of the forest, about 2 miles from where Mia was last seen. The team leader, a retired park ranger named Carl with weathered hands and kind eyes, explained that we'd spread out in a line, staying within voice range, and work our way systematically through the undergrowth. Our group was small, just 5 people including me. There was Carl, of course, then a married couple who ran the hardware store downtown, and a college kid home for summer break who kept checking his phone until Carl told him to save the battery. The forest was denser than I expected, with thick clusters of pine and oak that blocked most of the sunlight even at noon. We'd been searching for about 4 hours, calling Mia's name until our throats were raw, when the afternoon heat really started to press down. Carl had us take a water break near an old logging road, and that's when I heard it. Faint at first, almost lost in the rustle of leaves, but unmistakable once I focused on it. A child crying, high and desperate, coming from somewhere up the ridge to our right. I grabbed Carl's arm and pointed, but he was already on his radio, trying to raise the other teams to see if anyone else was hearing what we were hearing. The crying got louder, more urgent, and I couldn't just stand there anymore. I told Carl I was going to check it out, that it was maybe 200 yards up the slope at most. He shook his head, said protocol was to stay together, never split the team, but those sobs were tearing right through me. The hardware store couple, the Andersons, they heard it too, and the woman had tears in her eyes. Carl tried the radio again, but all he got was static, and the crying kept pulling at us, raw and terrified. I started moving toward the sound before I even realized I'd made the decision. Carl called after me to wait, that he'd go with me, but his knee had been giving him trouble all day and I was already scrambling up through the underbrush. I shouted back that I'd mark my path, that I'd yell if I found anything, and then I was pushing through a wall of mountain laurel, following those heartbreaking sounds. The ridge was steeper than it looked from below, covered in loose shale that kept sliding under my boots. I had to grab onto saplings and exposed roots to keep my balance, and twice I went down hard on my knees. The crying seemed to move, first ahead of me, then slightly to the left, like the child was wandering in circles. My volunteer vest kept snagging on thorns and low branches, and I could feel sweat running down my back, soaking through my shirt. About halfway up, I lost sight of the others completely, the forest swallowing even their voices. But the crying was clearer now, and mixed in with the sobs I could hear actual words, just fragments really, please and help, and what sounded like mommy. I pushed harder, my legs burning, thinking about that little girl alone out here for 3 days, probably dehydrated, definitely terrified, maybe hurt. The top of the ridge flattened out into a small clearing, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by a thick wall of evergreens. In the center, partially hidden by tall grass, was a faded blue camping tent, the kind you'd buy at any sporting goods store. The crying was coming from inside it, muffled but steady, and I practically ran toward it, calling out Mia's name. My voice cracked on the second syllable, and suddenly the crying stopped. Complete silence. Not even birds or insects, just my own ragged breathing and the blood pounding in my ears. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds waiting, then called out again, softer this time, saying it was okay, that I was here to help, that her parents were looking for her. Nothing. The tent didn't move, no response at all, and a cold weight started forming in my gut even though the afternoon sun was beating down on the back of my neck. I approached the tent slowly, noting how the grass around it had been trampled down in a rough circle, like someone had been walking around and around it. The zipper was partially open, maybe 6 inches, and through the gap I could see something dark inside. I reached for the zipper, announcing myself again, saying I was with the search party, that everything would be okay. My fingers were just touching the metal pull when I heard it again, the crying, but wrong somehow. It was coming from inside the tent, but had a tinny, hollow quality to it. I yanked the zipper down and stumbled backward when I saw what was inside. A small two-way radio, the heavy-duty kind contractors use, sitting on top of a bunched-up sleeping bag. The crying was coming from its speaker, looping now that I was paying attention. The same sequence of sobs and pleas repeating every 40 seconds or so. A recording. Someone had recorded a child crying and was broadcasting it from this radio. My mind went blank for a moment, just complete static, because this didn't make any sense. Who would do this? Why would anyone set up a fake distress call during an actual search for a missing child? Then the implications hit me all at once, like ice water flooding my veins. This was bait. Someone had deliberately lured me up here, away from the group, to this isolated spot where no one could see or hear me. I spun around, scanning the tree line, and that's when I noticed the footprints. Fresh ones in the soft dirt, leading from behind the tent in a wide arc through the grass, disappearing into the trees directly behind where I was now standing. The prints came out of the forest, circled the tent several times, then headed back into the woods, but on the opposite side from where I'd approached. Whoever made them had been here recently, maybe even while I was climbing the ridge, and could very well still be watching from the shadows between the trees. I reached for my phone with numb fingers, but of course there was no signal this deep in the forest. The radio in the tent kept playing its horrible loop, and now that I knew it was fake, I could hear how the breathing patterns were too regular, how the words were spaced too evenly. I grabbed the radio, looking for an off switch, and found a folded piece of paper taped to its back. My name was written on it. Not my full name, just my first name, Jennifer, in careful block letters with black ink. Someone knew I would be the one to find this. Someone had been watching our search team, had seen me specifically, had counted on me being the one to break away from the group when I heard the crying. The paper was damp with condensation, and when I unfolded it, there was a single line written inside. "You should have stayed with the others." A branch snapped somewhere behind me, not far, maybe 20 feet into the trees. I dropped the radio and it hit the ground, still playing that damned recording. Another snap, this one to my left, and I realized with perfect crystalline clarity that I was being herded. Whoever was out there wanted me to run in a specific direction, probably into another trap or toward a vehicle waiting on some old logging road. I thought about screaming for help, but Carl and the others were too far away, and it might provoke whoever was watching into acting faster. Instead, I did the only thing that made sense in that moment of pure panic and adrenaline. I ran straight back the way I'd come, crashing through the underbrush, skidding down the loose shale, not caring about the branches whipping across my face or the thorns tearing at my clothes. Behind me, I could hear pursuit, not running but walking steadily, deliberately, like they knew exactly where I was going and weren't worried about keeping up. Halfway down the ridge, my foot caught on an exposed root, and I went down hard, rolling several feet before slamming into a fallen log. Pain shot through my ribs, and for a moment I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, could only lie there gasping while listening to those steady footsteps getting closer. That's when I heard Carl's voice, faint but unmistakable, calling my name from somewhere below. I screamed then, screamed his name and help, and someone's following me, all in one hysterical burst. The footsteps behind me stopped. I scrambled to my feet, clutching my side, and half ran, half fell the rest of the way down the slope until I could see orange vests through the trees. Carl was climbing toward me with the college kid right behind him, both of them wide-eyed and breathing hard. I collapsed into Carl's arms, babbling about the tent and the radio and the note with my name on it, and he held me steady while scanning the ridge above us. But there was nothing there. No movement, no sound except that faint, tinny crying still drifting down from the tent. The police found the tent exactly where I said it would be, the radio still broadcasting its loop until the battery died around sunset. They photographed everything, bagged the radio and the note as evidence, took castings of the footprints. But there were no fingerprints on anything except mine, no DNA evidence, no trail to follow once the footprints reached the rocky ground on the far side of the clearing. They questioned everyone on the search teams, checked if anyone had been filming or taking pictures that might have caught someone watching us. Nothing. The detective, a woman with tired eyes who'd been working the case since Mia first disappeared, told me the setup had probably been there for hours before we arrived, that whoever did it had likely been gone long before I reached the tent. But I knew better. I'd heard those footsteps following me down the ridge, measured and patient, like someone who'd done this before and would do it again. She didn't argue with me, just wrote everything down and said they'd increase patrols in the area. They found Mia 2 days later, thank God, alive and relatively unharmed, hiding in a drainage pipe about a mile from her family's campsite. She'd gotten turned around in the dark and had been too scared to come out when she heard people calling. The news should have made me feel better, should have closed the chapter on that horrible Saturday, but it didn't. Because whoever set that trap, whoever wrote my name on that paper and waited in the woods, they weren't connected to Mia's disappearance at all. They were just someone who saw an opportunity in the chaos of a search, someone who wanted to separate a volunteer from the safety of the group. I changed my phone number, varied my routes to work, installed new locks and a security system. But sometimes, especially when I'm alone and hear a child crying in a grocery store or playground, my whole body goes cold and I'm back on that ridge, reading those 5 words that still wake me up at night. I never volunteered for another search. My college roommate Lisa had been trying to drag me out of the city for weeks, and when she mentioned an overnight fishing trip along the Clearwater River, I finally gave in. Her cousin Paul supposedly knew every hidden spot worth fishing up there, claimed his grandfather had shown him places where catfish grew bigger than your arm. I packed my gear that Saturday morning, stuffing my dad's old tackle box into the trunk, even though I hadn't used it since high school. 2 hours north through winding mountain roads, we met at the ranger station parking lot. Paul already there, leaning against his truck with a map spread on the hood. He kept pointing at different bends in the river, explaining how the current changed with the season, how November brought the big ones closer to shore. We had maybe 2 hours before dusk to scout the perfect spot for our overnight setup. Paul led us down the main trail from the parking area, his voice carrying through the trees as he explained water temperatures and feeding patterns. My day pack bounced against my back, loaded with water bottles, energy bars, and the headlamp Lisa insisted I bring for the scouting walk. About a mile in, the trail branched into 3 directions, and Paul stopped, studying each path like he was reading something the rest of us couldn't see. He pointed left toward what he called the deep pools, told Lisa to check the middle path that followed the river's main channel, then nodded at a narrow track cutting right through the birch trees. He pulled a whistle from his pocket, pressed it into my hand, said to give 3 sharp blasts if I found anything promising. 45 minutes, he said. Then we'd meet back here to compare notes before setting up camp at the best location. The game trail wound through tall grass and young birch trees, narrow enough that branches kept catching my sleeves. I could hear the river somewhere to my left, that constant rush of water over rocks, but couldn't see it through the thick undergrowth. After about 10 minutes of walking, the path opened into a small clearing where someone had built a fire ring from river stones, probably fishermen from earlier in the season. The ashes inside looked old, weathered by rain, and pine needles had blown across everything. I kept going, ducking under low branches, and that's when I spotted Paul's water bottle sitting perfectly upright on a flat rock beside the trail. Not tossed or dropped, but placed there deliberately, the blue Nalgene bottle he'd been drinking from during the drive-up. I picked it up, confused, wondering how he'd gotten over here when I'd watched him head the opposite direction. I called out his name, waited for a response, but only heard the river and wind moving through the trees. The bottle was empty, the cap screwed on tight, and I noticed the rock had been cleared of leaves and debris, like someone had prepared that exact spot. I tucked the bottle into my pack, figuring Paul must have scouted this trail earlier, maybe yesterday or this morning before Lisa and I arrived. But something about the placement bothered me, too deliberate, too much like a marker or sign. The trail curved ahead, disappearing into denser forest, and I almost turned back right then, except I could see another clearing through the trees that might open onto the river. 5 more minutes, I told myself. Then I'd head back whether I found a good spot or not. The clearing turned out to be a false promise, just another cluster of birch trees, but beyond it the trail started descending toward what had to be the river. That's where I found Lisa's baseball cap, the faded mariner's one she'd worn all day, hanging from a branch at exactly eye level. The branch had been bent down and twisted to hold it in place, deliberate enough that wind couldn't have done it. My chest tightened as I lifted the cap off the branch, turned it over in my hands. A few strands of her dark hair were still caught in the adjustment strap. I knew Lisa's path had run parallel to mine, maybe a quarter mile over, but there was no connecting trail I could see, no broken branches or footprints showing how the cap had traveled between paths. The sun was dropping faster now, throwing long shadows between the trees, and I pulled out my phone to check the time. No signal, which I'd expected, but I'd been walking for 25 minutes already. I should have blown the whistle then, should have turned around and jogged back to the meeting point, but I needed to understand what was happening. Lisa wouldn't have left her favorite cap, and Paul wouldn't have abandoned his water bottle, not when we'd need them for the overnight trip. I kept walking, slower now, scanning the ground and trees for any sign of my friends, for footprints or broken branches that might explain the items. The trail opened onto a narrow beach along the river, maybe 15 feet of rocky shore before the water started. Perfect spot for fishing, actually, with a deep pool where the current slowed and eddied back on itself. But what caught my attention were the fresh footprints in the sand, 2 sets walking along the water's edge, one larger, one smaller. Paul and Lisa had to be, except the tracks led in only one direction, heading downstream toward where the beach ended in a tangle of fallen trees. I followed the footprints, my boots crunching on the wet sand and river stones. They stayed close to the water, never deviating, never showing any sign of stopping or turning around. Where the beach narrowed, forcing me closer to the tree line, I found Paul's fishing vest draped over a piece of driftwood. The vest with all his gear, his lucky lures he'd been bragging about, the knife his grandfather had given him. Every pocket was still full, zipped closed, nothing taken. I grabbed the vest, slung it over my shoulder, and that's when I noticed the 3rd set of tracks. These came from the forest, larger boots with a deep tread pattern, and they followed behind Paul and Lisa's prints at maybe 10 feet back. The spacing was strange, irregular, like whoever made them kept stopping and starting, maintaining that exact distance. My mouth went dry as I traced the tracks with my eyes, saw how they never came closer, never fell farther behind, just shadowed my friend's path with mechanical precision. The light was failing now, that gray twilight that makes everything look flat and colorless. I pulled out my headlamp but didn't turn it on yet, not wanting to announce my position to whoever had left those tracks. The whistle was still in my pocket, but blowing it seemed pointless now, maybe even dangerous. I backtracked to where the 3rd set of prints emerged from the forest, found a narrow gap between 2 fallen logs where someone had pushed through. The bark was scuffed, fresh scratches in the wood, and there were broken twigs on the ground, stepped on deliberately to avoid making noise. I crawled through the gap, following the trail backward, trying to understand where this person had come from. The tracks led uphill, away from the river, weaving between trees with purpose. Then they stopped at a small rise that overlooked the beach, the spot where someone had stood watching, waiting. There were knee prints in the dirt where they'd crouched, and cigarette butts, 5 of them, ground out carefully and lined up in a row like they were keeping count of something. I stood there in the growing darkness, trying to piece together what I was seeing. Someone had watched Paul and Lisa from this spot, tracked them along the beach, but where were they now? The footprints on the beach had ended at the fallen trees with no return tracks, no sign of where anyone had gone. I turned to head back down to the river, and that's when I heard it. A branch snapping somewhere behind me, maybe 30 yards back in the direction I'd come from. Not the random crack of wood settling or an animal moving through, but the sharp, distinct sound of weight being placed wrong, then quickly shifted. I held my breath, stayed perfectly still, and heard nothing for 10, 20, 30 seconds. Then another step, careful this time, barely audible over the sound of the river below. Someone was following my exact path, had probably been following since I'd found the water bottle, letting me collect the items they'd placed, watching me discover each piece of their setup. My mind raced through the options while my body stayed frozen. Run back to the cars, but that meant passing whoever was behind me. Continue downstream, but the tracks had led to a dead end. Hide and wait them out, but darkness was maybe 15 minutes away and they obviously knew these woods better than I did. I chose movement, stepping as quietly as possible down the slope toward the river, using trees for cover, trying to circle wide around where I'd heard the footsteps. Every few steps I'd pause, listen, and each time I stopped, the forest behind me would go silent too, like we were playing some horrible version of red light, green light. The pattern was too perfect, too controlled, and I realized this person wasn't just following, they were herding me, pushing me towards something specific. When I tried to veer left, back toward the main trail, a whistle came from that direction, 3 short blasts, the exact signal Paul had told us to use. But it wasn't Paul's whistle. The pitch was wrong, higher, and it came from the wrong direction entirely. The river was my only option now, the water loud enough to cover my movement, cold enough to break any scent trail if this person had dogs. I crashed through the last bit of undergrowth, not caring about noise anymore, and hit the beach running. My headlamp bounced in my pack as I sprinted along the rocky shore, following Paul and Lisa's tracks toward the fallen trees. Behind me, I heard whoever it was drop all pretense of stealth, heavy boots pounding down the slope I'd just descended. They were faster than me on familiar ground, and I could hear them gaining as I reached the log jam where the tracks ended. That's when I saw it. A blue tarp stretched between 2 trees just beyond the fallen logs, and underneath it, Paul and Lisa, sitting on the ground with their backs against a large boulder. They weren't moving, weren't responding to my shouts, and as I scrambled over the logs toward them, I saw why. Their hands were zip-tied behind their backs, duct tape across their mouths, and their eyes were wide with terror, looking not at me, but past me, at whoever was now climbing over the logs behind me. I grabbed the knife from Paul's vest, sliced through Lisa's zip ties first while she made frantic sounds through the tape. The footsteps behind me had stopped, and when I glanced back, I saw a man standing on top of the log pile, maybe 15 feet away. He was older, maybe 50, wearing hunting camo and a backpack, holding a camera with a long lens. Not pointing it at us, just holding it, watching. Lisa ripped the tape off her mouth, gasped something about him taking pictures of them all afternoon, following them from spot to spot, getting closer each time. I cut Paul free while keeping my eyes on the man, who still hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, just stood there like he was waiting for something. Paul grabbed his vest from me, pulled out a canister of bear spray he kept in the inner pocket, and that's when the man finally moved, not toward us but backward, disappearing over the logs into the growing darkness. We didn't wait to see if he'd come back, just ran upstream along the beach, scrambling over rocks and through shallow water until we found a deer trail that led back up toward the main path. The 3 of us made it back to the parking lot in under 20 minutes, running most of the way with our headlamps cutting wild arcs through the darkness. Paul's truck was still there, my car next to it, but there was a third vehicle now, an old van with mud-covered plates parked at the far end. We didn't stop to investigate, just threw our gear in the trucks and peeled out of there, Paul leading the way with Lisa in his passenger seat while I followed close behind. We drove straight to the ranger station, but it was closed, dark, nobody around. The nearest police station was 40 minutes away in town, and by the time we got there and explained everything to the officer on duty, it was past 9 at night. They sent 2 units back to the trailhead with us, but the van was gone, no sign of anyone in the woods. The police took our statements, said they'd increase patrols in the area, but without a clear photo of the man or a license plate number, there wasn't much they could do. Lisa remembered seeing him earlier that day at the ranger station, pretending to study the trail maps while they were getting their fishing permits, and Paul said he'd noticed someone matching that description at the gas station where we'd stopped for supplies. We never went back to fish the Clearwater River, never even talked about trying again somewhere else. Lisa moved in with her sister in Portland a few months later, said she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched even in the city. Paul still goes fishing, but only in groups now, never alone, never in remote spots. The police called me once, about 6 weeks after that night, said they'd found an abandoned campsite deeper in the woods with dozens of photos tacked to trees, all of different people on trails, at beaches, setting up camp. None of us were in those photos, which somehow made it worse knowing we weren't the first, probably wouldn't be the last. I still think about that man sometimes, standing on those logs in the darkness, how he moved backward into the forest like he belonged there, like we were the intruders in his territory. I think about those 5 cigarette butts lined up in a row, and I wonder what he was counting, what signal he was waiting for, what would have happened if I'd arrived 5 minutes later, or not at all. Most folks around here inherit their first rifle the same way they inherit their grandfather's watch, passed down when you're old enough to understand its weight. Mine came wrapped in an old wool blanket on my 14th birthday, along with Dad's promise to take me out to the Carter's property once deer season rolled around. By the time I turned 23, we'd made that trip to Virginia every November like clockwork. Just the two of us camping in that same clearing near the creek where Dad said he'd taken his first buck 40 years prior. That particular Saturday started out perfect, crisp autumn air, and not a cloud in sight. The kind of day where you can smell winter creeping in through the dried leaves. We'd driven down from Roanoke in Dad's pickup, the bed loaded with our gear and enough provisions for 3 days, though we both knew we'd probably head back Sunday night regardless of what we bagged. Setting up camp went like it always did, each of us falling into our roles without needing to speak much about it. Dad handled the fire pit while I strung up our food supplies between 2 oaks, high enough that the black bears wouldn't get interested. The Carters owned about 300 acres of prime hunting land, mostly dense forest, with a few natural clearings where the deer liked to graze at dawn and dusk. They lived up in Washington now, some government job that kept them busy year-round, but they let a handful of locals use the land during hunting season, as long as we kept to ourselves and didn't leave a mess. We'd seen their nephew once, maybe twice over the years, checking on the old cabin near the eastern boundary, but otherwise the place stayed empty from September through January. Dad always said that's what made it perfect, just wilderness and silence. No other hunters stumbling through your spot or scaring off the game. We spent the afternoon scouting, walking the trails we knew by heart, and checking for fresh signs. Found plenty of tracks near the water, droppings that couldn't have been more than a day old, and rubs on the saplings where the bucks had been marking their territory. Dad pointed out a scrape beneath a low-hanging pine branch, the earth torn up and musky with scent, said we should set up near there come evening. His knees weren't what they used to be, I could tell by the way he favored his right leg going uphill, though he'd never admit it out loud. We decided he'd take the stand we'd built 3 seasons back, about 15 feet up in a sturdy hickory with clear sight lines to the creek, while I'd position myself on the ground near a cluster of white pines about 70 yards east. The plan was simple enough. Wait for the golden hour when they'd come down to drink, take a clean shot if we got one, track it if necessary. By 5:30 we were in position, the forest settling into that peculiar quiet that comes before dusk. I had my rifle resting across my lap, safety on, breathing slow and steady the way Dad taught me, becoming part of the landscape. The temperature dropped fast once the sun started sinking behind the ridge, maybe 45 degrees, cold enough that my breath came out in little puffs that I tried to aim away from my scope. Every small sound seemed amplified in that stillness. A squirrel rustling through the leaves 20 yards away might as well have been an elephant. A woodpecker's distant hammering echoed like gunfire. Then I heard it. The snap of a branch followed by another, deliberate and heavy, coming from the north. Through the gaps in the pine needles I caught movement, a flash of brown against the darkening forest. Then the full shape emerged into the small clearing ahead of me. 8-point buck, massive, probably 200 pounds if he was an ounce, walking with that careful grace they have when they're not quite sure about something. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, nostrils flaring, testing the wind, one ear swiveling toward where Dad sat in his stand. I clicked off the safety, trying to control the adrenaline surge that always came at moments like this, my finger hovering just outside the trigger guard. The buck took 3 more steps forward, turning broadside to me, the perfect shot presenting itself like a gift. I squeezed the trigger on an exhale, the rifle kicking back against my shoulder, the crack of the shot shattering the evening quiet. The buck jumped straight up, that telltale mule kick that meant I'd hit the vitals, then bolted into the trees heading southeast. I could hear him crashing through the underbrush, the sound growing fainter. Then nothing. Dad's whistle came from the stand, 2 short bursts that meant good shot. Wait 30 minutes before tracking. Those 30 minutes crawled by slower than any I could remember, sitting there in the growing darkness with my heart still racing. Dad climbed down from his stand and made his way over, clapping me on the shoulder, that proud smile visible even in the dim light. We went through the ritual of marking where I'd taken the shot, finding the first drops of blood on the leaves, bright red and frothy, which meant lung shot, a good clean kill. The blood trail was easy to follow at first, splattered on the dried ferns and oak leaves, leading us deeper into the woods along what seemed like an old game trail. Dad stayed behind me with the flashlight while I tracked, both of us moving quiet out of habit more than necessity. About 80 yards in, the trail opened into another small clearing, and I could make out the shape of the buck lying on its side near a fallen log. I remember feeling that mix of elation and respect you get when you take a life for food, already thinking about how we'd dress it and pack out the meat. But when I got within 10 feet of where the buck should have been, I stopped so sudden that Dad nearly walked into me. The deer was there, but it had been moved, dragged maybe 6 or 7 feet from where the blood trail ended, leaving these deep furrows in the dirt like something had grabbed it by the neck and pulled. The belly had been opened up, not with any tool I recognized the work of, but torn apart, the edges ragged like they'd been pulled rather than cut. Steam was still rising from the cavity in the cold air, which meant this had happened minutes ago, maybe while we were walking up. The intestines were gone, along with the liver and heart, but not scattered around like a coyote or bear would leave them. Just gone, taken. Dad's flashlight beam swept across the carcass, and I saw his face go rigid, that expression he got when something wasn't adding up right. Neither of us said anything for a moment, just stood there listening to the forest, which had gone completely silent, not even the usual insect noise you'd expect after dark. Dad grabbed my arm, not hard but firm enough to get my attention, and nodded toward the way we'd come. We started backing up, keeping our eyes on the trees around us, when I heard it, clear as if someone was standing right beside me. A voice that whispered, "That's mine," in this flat, wrong tone that made every hair on my neck stand straight up. The voice came from somewhere behind the fallen log, maybe 15 feet away, but when Dad swung his flashlight that direction, there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. We both had our rifles up now, safeties off, trying to cover different angles while moving backward toward the trail. Then we heard footsteps, heavy and deliberate, circling around us just outside the flashlight's reach, branches breaking with no attempt at stealth. Dad pulled out his phone. No signal, of course, we were too deep in the woods, but the screen light gave us a little more visibility. That's when I saw them, 2 eyes reflecting the light about 30 yards out, too high up to be a deer, too far apart to be anything that should have been in those woods. The circling stopped, and for maybe 10 seconds, everything went quiet again, except for our breathing. Dad whispered for me to stay close. We were going to move fast back to camp, forget the deer. Forget everything except getting out of there. We'd made it maybe 20 steps when something crashed through the underbrush to our left, big enough to shake the ground under our boots, and that voice came again. Closer this time, saying, "Mine, mine, mine," over and over in this monotone chant that didn't sound entirely human. Dad fired a warning shot into the air, the sound explosive in the darkness, and whatever was out there went silent. We ran then. I'm not ashamed to admit it. 2 grown men with rifles sprinting through the dark forest, like kids running from a nightmare. Branches tore at our clothes. I nearly went down twice, tripping over roots, but we kept moving, Dad's flashlight beam bouncing wildly ahead of us. Behind us, I could hear pursuit, not running but moving fast through the trees, keeping pace without seeming to exert effort. We burst into our campsite and Dad immediately went for the truck, throwing our rifles in the bed while I grabbed the essential gear, leaving everything else behind. The engine turned over on the 3rd try, headlights cutting through the darkness to illuminate the trail out. As Dad threw it in reverse to turn around, something walked into the edge of the headlight beam, just for a second before stepping back into the shadows. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, walking upright but wrong somehow in its proportions. Arms too long, shoulders too narrow, and its face, God. Its face was almost human but stretched out, like someone had grabbed a normal face and pulled it forward. The mouth opened too wide, and even over the engine I heard it say "mine" one more time before Dad gunned it down the trail. We didn't stop driving until we hit the main road, didn't talk about what we'd seen until we were sitting in a well-lit diner 2 towns over, trying to make sense of something that didn't fit into any explanation we could accept. Dad called the Carters the next morning, told them we'd had to leave suddenly due to a family emergency, apologized for leaving some gear behind. They said they'd have their nephew check on it when he went down next month, make sure everything was all right. We never went back to get our stuff, never went back to hunt those woods again, and Dad sold his rifle the following spring, said he'd lost his taste for it. I kept mine but haven't used it since, just sits in the safe like some kind of reminder. We looked into the history of that land afterward, spent weeks going through old newspaper archives and county records, trying to find something that might explain what we encountered. Found a few missing persons cases from the 50s and 60s, hunters mostly, but nothing conclusive, nothing that gave us the answers we wanted. The only thing we discovered that made my skin prickle was an old property survey from 1892 that mentioned the eastern section of what became the Carter property was avoided by locals, something about it being claimed ground, though it didn't elaborate on what that meant. These days, Dad and I don't talk about that night unless we've had a few drinks. And even then we dance around the details, like saying it out loud might invite it back somehow. Sometimes I drive past the road that leads to the Carter property, always in daylight, never slowing down, and I wonder if it's still out there in those woods, waiting for the next hunter to take something it considers its own. I've thought about warning people, maybe posting something online about staying away from that area, but what would I say that wouldn't sound completely insane? That something in those woods claimed my deer and showed us its face? That it walked upright and spoke but wasn't human? No one would believe it. Hell, sometimes I barely believe it myself, except Dad was there too, saw the same thing, and that's the only reason I know I didn't lose my mind that night in Virginia. Picture 4 grown adults crammed into a break room that smells like burnt coffee and microwaved fish, avoiding eye contact while HR drones on about fostering team cohesion after recent challenges. That was us 2 weeks ago, getting lectured because someone had filed a complaint about our department's toxic atmosphere, which, honestly, was putting it mildly, considering what had gone down between us over the past few months. Gregory from accounting suggested the hiking trip, said it would be good for us to get away from the office, from the fluorescent lights and passive-aggressive emails, and actually talk things through like normal human beings. I should have known better when he mentioned he'd found this perfect trail online. Not too challenging, but remote enough that we'd have to rely on each other. His exact words. And I remember thinking that sounded more like a threat than a team-building exercise. Saturday morning came too fast, and there we were at the trailhead parking lot. Me, Gregory, Monica from procurement, and Jason, who just transferred from the Seattle branch 3 months ago and had the misfortune of landing right in the middle of our dysfunction. Monica kept checking her phone obsessively, even though we all knew there'd be no signal once we started climbing. Jason was doing this fake cheerful thing where he commented on literally everything like some kind of nature documentary narrator. And Gregory had this massive military-style backpack like we were summiting Everest, instead of doing a 2-day loop through state forest land. The official trail started nice enough, wide and well-marked with those yellow blazes every 50 feet or so. And for about 2 hours, we actually managed to maintain something resembling normal conversation, talking about anything except the investigation, the screenshots, the meeting where Monica had completely lost it and threw her coffee mug at the wall, narrowly missing Jason's head. Around noon, just when my feet were starting to complain and Jason had finally shut up about the native flora, Gregory stopped abruptly at what barely qualified as a fork in the trail. To the left, the yellow blazes continued clearly marking the official path that curved gently upward. But to the right was this narrow deer track, or maybe an old logging road, barely visible through the undergrowth, disappearing into much denser forest. Gregory pulled out his phone, squinting at some hiking app he'd downloaded, claiming this unmarked path would cut 3 miles off our route and get us to the campsite with plenty of daylight to spare. Monica immediately started arguing that we should stick to the marked trail, her voice getting that sharp edge I recognized from budget meetings, while Jason tried to play peacemaker, suggesting we take a vote like this was some kind of democracy instead of a potential disaster waiting to happen. The thing about Gregory is, he has this way of making you feel stupid for disagreeing with him, like he's already thought through every possible objection and you're just too slow to catch up. He kept showing us his phone screen with the GPS overlay, insisting the shortcut connected back to the main trail in about 4 miles, that locals probably used it all the time, that we were being paranoid for no reason. Monica was the first to cave, probably because she didn't want to look weak in front of everyone. And once she agreed, Jason immediately fell in line, leaving me as the sole voice of reason that nobody wanted to hear. We stood there for maybe 10 minutes, the forest getting quieter around us like even the birds knew we were about to make a terrible decision. And finally I said, fine, whatever. But if we got lost, it was on Gregory's head, which in retrospect was probably the stupidest thing I could have said given everything that happened next. The unmarked path started out deceptively easy, wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, with occasional ribbons tied to branches that Gregory insisted were trail markers left by other hikers. But after about an hour, those ribbons disappeared completely, and the path kept splitting into smaller tracks that all looked identical, forcing us to rely entirely on Gregory's phone GPS, which he checked obsessively every few minutes. The battery icon in the corner showing a steadily declining percentage that nobody wanted to mention. The forest here was different too, older somehow, with these massive oak trees whose branches formed a canopy so thick that even in the middle of the afternoon it felt like twilight, and the undergrowth was this tangle of thorns and poison ivy that grabbed at our clothes and left angry red scratches on any exposed skin. By 3 in the afternoon, we'd been walking for 5 hours total, and Monica was starting to panic in that controlled way she had, where her voice stayed level, but her eyes darted around like a trapped animal. She kept asking Gregory if he was sure we were going the right way, and he kept saying yes, absolutely. Just another mile or so, but I could tell from the way he gripped his phone that he wasn't sure of anything anymore. Jason had gone completely quiet, which was somehow worse than his constant chatter, and every time we stopped to check the GPS or argue about which barely visible path to take, I noticed how the forest sounds would stop too. No birds, no insects, just this oppressive silence that made our voices sound too loud, too human, too out of place in whatever part of the wilderness we'd stumbled into. The real argument started around 5, when Gregory's phone finally died, and we had to admit we were completely, utterly lost. Monica went from controlled panic to full-blown fury, screaming at Gregory that this was exactly like him, always thinking he knew better than everyone else. Just like with the Morrison account that he'd tanked because he wouldn't listen to anyone's input. Gregory shot back that at least he hadn't been stealing clients like she had, which made Jason nervously interject that we should focus on finding our way out instead of rehashing office drama. But that just redirected Monica's rage toward him, asking what he'd know about anything since he'd only been there 3 months and had already managed to sleep with half the support staff. The accusations flew back and forth, each more vicious than the last. Our professional facades completely shattered as we stood there in the growing darkness. And that's when I noticed it. Just at the edge of my vision, a flash of blue fabric moving between the trees about 30 yards away. There 1 second and gone the next. I tried to point it out, but they were too busy tearing into each other to listen. Monica now accusing Gregory of deliberately getting us lost as some kind of power play. Gregory calling her paranoid and unstable. Jason trying to physically get between them as their shouting match escalated into something that looked like it might turn physical. The blue fabric appeared again, closer this time, maybe 20 yards away, and I could make out that it was someone in a jacket, just standing there behind a thick pine tree, watching us. When I finally managed to shout loud enough to get their attention and pointed to where the person had been standing, there was nothing there, just empty forest. And they all looked at me like I was losing it, the stress finally getting to me. But I knew what I'd seen, and the way the hair on my neck was standing up told me we weren't alone out here. That someone had been following us, maybe since we'd left the marked trail, maybe longer. We decided to make camp right there, not because it was a good spot, but because it was getting dark and nobody could agree on which direction to try next. The clearing was barely big enough for our tents, surrounded by these twisted birch trees that looked like bones in the fading light, and we set up in angry silence, each person as far from the others as the small space would allow. Monica had brought one of those emergency whistles and kept blowing it every few minutes. 3 sharp blasts that echoed through the forest until Gregory told her to stop because she was giving him a headache, which started another argument about whose fault this was, who had the right to be angry, who should have known better. I kept watching the tree line while setting up my tent, looking for any sign of movement, that blue jacket, anything. But the forest had gone completely dark beyond our small circle of flashlight beams, and all I could see were shadows that might have been anything or nothing at all. Dinner was these dehydrated meal packets that tasted like cardboard soaked in salt water, eaten in hostile silence, broken only by the sound of Jason obsessively checking his dead phone like it might magically spring back to life. Around 9, Monica announced she was going to bed, zipping herself into her tent with enough force to nearly break the zipper, and Jason followed soon after, mumbling something about trying to get some rest so we could think clearly in the morning. That left me and Gregory sitting across from each other at the small camp stove, its blue flame the only light besides our dying flashlights, and he finally dropped his know-it-all act and admitted he had no idea where we were, that the GPS had been glitching even before the phone died, showing our location jumping around impossibly, sometimes putting us miles away from where we'd been seconds before. He said he'd noticed something else too, these old campsites along the unmarked trail. Fire rings that looked recent but somehow wrong, like someone had been camping out here regularly, watching the trails, waiting for people stupid enough to wander off the marked paths. I barely slept that night, every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves sending adrenaline shooting through my system, and when I did drift off, I had these vivid dreams about being watched through the thin tent walls, shadows moving just outside, circling our camp like predators. When dawn finally broke, gray and misty, I crawled out to find Monica already up, standing at the edge of our clearing with her back to me, completely still. And when I called her name, she turned around with this blank expression and said, "Jason's tent was empty. his sleeping bag still inside but his backpack gone. We searched the immediate area, calling his name until our voices went hoarse. But there was no sign of him, no footprints leading away from camp, nothing except this sick feeling in my gut that whoever had been watching us yesterday had come back during the night, and Jason, always trying to avoid conflict, had probably gone with them willingly rather than wake us up and cause another scene. Gregory insisted Jason had just gone to find help on his own, too fed up with our bickering to wait for us to agree on a direction. But Monica found Jason's phone half buried in pine needles about 10 feet from his tent, and when she managed to get it powered on with her portable charger, there was a voice recording from 3:47 a.m. The audio was mostly static and wind, but underneath you could hear footsteps circling the camp, slow and deliberate, stopping occasionally right outside one of our tents. And then Jason's voice, barely a whisper, saying, "Hey, wait, what are you doing?" before the recording cut off. We played it 3 more times, each replay making it clearer that those footsteps had been there for at least 20 minutes before Jason noticed them, that whoever it was had been studying us, choosing, and the worst part was recognizing a sound in the background I hadn't noticed while sleeping. This low humming, almost like someone trying to remember a tune, getting closer and closer to Jason's tent until the recording ended. After the recording, we didn't need to discuss it. We just started packing, throwing everything into our bags with shaking fingers while constantly checking behind us, the forest suddenly feeling like it had eyes everywhere. Monica kept Jason's phone, said we'd need it for evidence when we got out, if we got out, and nobody argued with the way her voice cracked on that last part. We picked a direction, any direction that seemed to lead downhill, and started walking fast, almost running, crashing through the underbrush without caring about the trail anymore, just needing to get away from that clearing, from whatever had taken Jason, from the feeling that we were being herded like cattle towards some predetermined end. Gregory was in the lead, using a broken branch to clear the path, when he suddenly stopped and pointed at something carved into a tree trunk, fresh cuts in the bark that looked maybe a day old, just 4 words that made my entire body go cold. "You chose this path." We found the marked trail 2 hours later, those beautiful yellow blazes appearing like salvation through the trees, and we practically ran the rest of the way back to the parking lot, not stopping even when Monica twisted her ankle on a root, just supporting her between us and pushing forward. The lot was empty except for our cars and one other vehicle I didn't remember from yesterday, an old green pickup with mud-caked plates, and we didn't stick around to investigate, just threw our gear in the trunks and got out of there. We called the police from the first gas station we found, reported Jason missing, gave them the GPS coordinates from Gregory's app history, played them the recording from Jason's phone, but when search and rescue went in the next day, they said they couldn't find our campsite. No sign anyone had been there at all, like the forest had swallowed up any trace of what happened. They kept searching for 3 weeks before calling it off, said Jason probably got disoriented and wandered off, maybe fell into a ravine. But Monica and Gregory and I know better. We know someone was out there with us, watching, waiting, taking, and the worst part is that we led Jason right to them. Delivered him gift-wrapped because we were too proud to admit Gregory's shortcut was a mistake. I quit my job the day after they called off the search. Couldn't stand being in that office knowing Jason's desk would stay empty, and I heard Monica and Gregory left soon after, the whole department basically imploding, which I guess was what HR wanted all along, just not like this, never like this. Montana in early May feels like the world just woke up from a long sleep, and that particular Saturday morning, I'd driven out to fish a section of the Bitterroot that most folks don't bother with anymore. Been fishing these waters since my college roommate introduced me to fly fishing back when we were both studying at Missoula, which makes it about 15 years now, give or take. The spot sits about 40 miles from any real town, down a dirt road that turns into barely a trail, then becomes nothing but deer paths through the pines. You have to want it bad enough to bushwhack the last quarter mile carrying all your gear, sliding down loose shale and pushing through serviceberry bushes that leave scratches on your waders. But the rainbow trout in that stretch of river make every scraped knuckle and thorn prick worth it, especially in spring when the snow melt brings them out hungry and careless. By noon, I'd already landed 3 decent rainbows and lost what felt like a monster brown trout that snapped my tippet clean off near a submerged log. The sun was hitting that perfect angle where you can see straight through the water to the riverbed, all those smooth stones shifting between green and gold in the current. I was working my way upstream, casting into a deep pool where the main channel cuts hard against a granite cliff, when movement in my peripheral vision made me glance across to the opposite bank. Someone was standing in the shadows between 2 massive Douglas firs, maybe 60 feet away from me, just standing there, not moving, not fishing, not doing anything that made sense for a person to be doing in the middle of nowhere on a Saturday afternoon. At first I figured it had to be another angler scouting the water, maybe waiting for me to move on so he could fish the pool. We fishermen can be territorial about good spots. And I get it, especially when you've hiked that far in. I raised my hand in a friendly wave, the universal river greeting between anglers, but the guy didn't wave back, didn't nod, didn't acknowledge me at all. He just stood there, arms hanging loose at his sides. And that's when I noticed something was wrong with his clothes. They weren't clothes exactly, more like rags or maybe just a really old shirt and pants that had been through hell, all torn up and hanging weird on his frame. The color was all wrong too, this brownish gray that matched the mud along the riverbank, like he'd been rolling in it or living in it. I turned back to my fishing, telling myself to mind my own business, but every few casts I'd steal a glance across the river. The man never moved, not once, just kept watching from between those trees with his face half hidden in shadow. After about 10 minutes of this, I hooked into another rainbow, a real fighter that took line and jumped twice before I could work it into the shallows. The whole time I'm playing this fish, concentrating on keeping the right tension, working it away from a tangle of roots, I can feel eyes on me. When I finally got the trout in my net and looked up, the man had moved closer to the water's edge, maybe 30 feet away now, and that's when I saw he was barefoot. Not just barefoot, but his feet were caked in thick mud up past his ankles, and his toenails were long and yellowed, curling over the ends of his toes like they hadn't been cut in months or maybe years. The smart thing would have been to pack up and leave right then, but I'd driven 3 hours and hiked another 40 minutes to fish this spot, and some mud-covered weirdo wasn't going to run me off. Besides, the river was between us, running fast and cold with snowmelt, at least waist-deep in most places and deeper in the main channel. I released the rainbow and moved upstream to the next good run, where the water spreads out over a gravel bar before collecting into another deep pool. Cast after cast, I tried to focus on my technique, on reading the water, on anything except the fact that this guy was following me along the opposite bank, matching my pace perfectly. He moved through the thick underbrush without making a sound I could hear over the river, never stumbling, never pushing branches aside, just gliding between the trees like smoke. By the time I hooked my 6th fish of the day, a fat cutthroat that hit my dry fly right at the tail of a riffle, the man had positioned himself directly across from me again. The river was narrower here, maybe 40 feet wide, and I could see his face clearly for the first time. His hair was dark and matted down flat against his skull, streaked with what looked like algae or riverweed. His eyes were pale blue, almost white, and they tracked every movement I made as I brought the fish in. But it was his expression that made my chest tighten, completely blank, no emotion at all, like watching a mannequin that could walk. When I bent down to unhook the cutthroat, keeping it in the water while I worked the barbless hook free, I heard something that made me stop cold. A splash, not big, just the sound of something entering the water on the other side of the river. I looked up and the man was knee-deep in the current, walking straight toward me through the rushing water like it was nothing. The river that had me bracing against every step when I'd waded in, that would knock most people off their feet in the deeper sections, didn't seem to affect him at all. He moved forward steady and smooth, his eyes locked on mine, never blinking, never looking away even when the current pushed debris into his path. My cutthroat thrashed free and disappeared, while I stood there like an idiot, holding my rod in one hand and an empty net in the other, watching this muddy stranger wade through water that should have been sweeping him downstream. The closer he got, the more wrong everything about him looked. His skin had this grayish tint under all the dirt, and there were dark stains around his mouth and under his fingernails that could have been blood, or could have been something else. 20 feet away, 15, 10, and now I could smell him over the clean scent of the river. This thick, rotten odor like meat left in the sun, mixed with pond scum and human waste. I started backing up, slipping on the wet rocks, trying to keep distance between us while my mind screamed at me to run. But he kept coming, pushed through the deepest part of the channel where the water reached his chest, and his mouth opened for the first time, not to speak but just hanging open like he'd forgotten how to close it. Inside, his teeth were brown and broken, some missing entirely, and his tongue was swollen and dark purple. When he was maybe 8 feet away, close enough that I could see bits of leaves and pine needles tangled in his beard, close enough that the smell made me gag, he stopped. Just stopped dead in the middle of the river and stared at me with those empty, pale eyes. We stood there for what felt like hours but was probably 30 seconds, him swaying slightly in the current with his mouth hanging open, me gripping my fly rod like it was some kind of weapon. Then his head tilted to one side, a slow, mechanical movement, and he raised one arm to point at my fishing vest. Not at me, specifically at the vest where I kept my caught fish in the inner pocket, the ones I was planning to take home for dinner. His finger stayed extended, shaking slightly, and then he made this sound, not quite a word, more like a wet gurgle from deep in his throat. He took another step forward, and I stumbled backward so fast I fell, landing hard on my ass in the shallow water, cold river flooding into my waders. Scrambling to get up, I saw him bend down and pick something up from the riverbed. A dead trout that must have washed down from upstream. Probably been dead for days by the look of it. He brought the fish to his mouth and bit into it, scales, guts and all, tearing off chunks with those broken teeth while never taking his eyes off me. River water and fish blood ran down his chin, mixing with the mud and whatever else was caked on his face, and he chewed with his mouth open, making these horrible wet sounds. That broke whatever spell had been keeping me there. I turned and ran, or tried to run in waders filled with water, more like a desperate waddle toward the bank. Behind me I heard splashing, heavy and fast, and I knew he was coming after me. I made it to shore and crashed through the serviceberry bushes, branches tearing at my vest and hat, not caring about the trail or my rod or anything except getting away from whatever that thing wearing a human shape was. The quarter-mile back to my truck felt like 10 miles. I kept hearing things behind me, breaking branches, heavy footsteps, but every time I looked back there was nothing there, just empty forest. My waders were so full of water, they pulled at every step, and I ended up cutting them off with my pocket knife halfway up the slope, leaving $800 worth of Sims gear hanging from a pine branch. When I finally saw my truck through the trees, I almost cried from relief. I fumbled for my keys with numb fingers, dropped them twice before managing to unlock the door, and jumped inside. In the rearview mirror, just as I started the engine, I saw him standing at the edge of the tree line, perfectly still again, watching. He had something in his hand, another dead fish, or maybe the same one. Hard to tell from that distance. I drove out of there doing 40 on a road meant for maybe 15 miles per hour, bottoming out the truck twice and probably destroying my alignment. Didn't stop until I hit the gas station at the highway junction, where the kid working the counter took one look at me, soaking wet, covered in scratches, missing my waders, and asked if I needed him to call someone. I said no, bought a coffee with shaking hands, and sat in my truck for an hour trying to make sense of what had happened. Later, I did some asking around at the fly shop in town, careful not to sound too crazy, just mentioning I'd seen someone strange out by the river. The owner got quiet and said there'd been reports over the years, usually from solo fishermen, about a man living wild in those woods. Said he might have been someone who went missing from the state hospital 20 years back, or could be a veteran who never came home right from one of the wars, or maybe just some person who decided civilization wasn't for them anymore. Nobody knew for sure, and nobody wanted to find out bad enough to go looking. I never went back to that stretch of river, and I fish with a buddy now always. The trout aren't worth it, no matter how big they are or how hungry they're biting. The route I took that night was one I had never planned to use. My dispatcher had called in late, asking if I could deliver a load of industrial supplies to a small town near the Tennessee border. It was supposed to be a straight shot down the interstate, but a wreck ahead shut down the main highway. I pulled over at a gas station, talked to an old man who pointed out a shortcut through the Kentucky hills, narrow, twisting back roads with barely enough shoulder for a rig my size. It was late, past midnight, and the air had that thick, heavy stillness you get before dawn. I figured the quiet might help me make good time. The road wound deeper into the hills, past patches of forest that looked endless under the truck's high beams. I had the radio on low, some AM talk show fading in and out, when I saw movement near the ditch line ahead. My first thought was a deer, but then I noticed the shape. Small, human, kneeling. A woman, or at least I thought it was. Her hair hung forward, long and tangled, and she seemed to be crouched right at the edge where the forest met the road. I slowed down, leaned forward over the steering wheel, trying to make sense of it through the windshield. When my headlights washed fully over her, I realized she wasn't moving, just frozen there, hands on the ground like she was searching for something. Instinct kicked in. I eased the truck onto the gravel shoulder and killed the engine. The silence outside hit me hard. Only the low buzz of insects and the faint rustle of trees in the dark. I opened the door and called out, asking if she was hurt, if she needed help. No answer. She turned her head slowly, and for the briefest second, I caught her face. Pale, streaked with dirt, eyes wide and glassy like she didn't recognize where she was. Before I could take another step, she bolted. No scream, no sound of branches breaking, just the motion of her body vanishing between the trees. I shouted again, louder this time, but the forest swallowed the sound whole. I stood there for a while, scanning the tree line, my flashlight cutting through the dark. It was like she had dissolved into the woods. I thought about calling the sheriff's office right there, but I convinced myself she was probably scared or maybe high and didn't want to be found. I got back in the truck and drove off, uneasy but trying to shake it off as just another strange thing you see on the road. About an hour later, I stopped at a diner near a small crossroads town, just to clear my head. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, how she had turned without a word and vanished. The waitress noticed I looked uneasy, asked if I was okay. I told her what I'd seen, half expecting her to laugh it off, but she didn't. She said people around those hills talked about missing hikers, about folks who wandered off the road and were never found. Her tone wasn't dramatic, just quiet, like she'd heard it too many times before. That made me more unsettled than anything else. By the time I reached my drop-off, dawn had started breaking over the hills. The light was soft and hazy, and for a moment everything felt normal again. I parked, handed over the papers, and tried not to mention the woman. I figured maybe I'd just misread the whole thing. Maybe she was fine. But sleep didn't come easy later that morning. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pale face turning toward me, the way she seemed lost and hollow, as if she didn't belong in that place or that moment. When I woke up, I checked my phone. There was a local news alert about police activity along a county road not far from where I'd stopped the night before. The photo showed a stretch of road bordered by thick woods, the same spot. Curiosity got the better of me, and I drove back out there before heading home. 2 patrol cars and a white van were parked along the shoulder, Yellow tape fluttered in the breeze, tied between the trees. I didn't want to get in the way, but one of the deputies noticed me slowing down and waved me through cautiously. Later that evening, I read the article online. It said that early that morning, a jogger had reported what looked like drag marks leading from the ditch into the woods. Police had found a torn piece of fabric, red and frayed, caught on a branch nearby. They hadn't identified anyone or confirmed what had happened, but the picture that came with the story, the ditch, the tree line, the angle of the road, was exactly where I had seen her. That realization hit harder than I expected, and for a long time I just sat there staring at the screen, wondering if I should have done more, if maybe she was still out there when I drove away. I went back to work the next week, trying to focus on driving and not on what I might have witnessed. But every time I took a night route through rural areas, I caught myself scanning the edges of the road, half expecting to see someone there again. About a month later, I got assigned a run through the same county. I told myself it was just another job, that the odds of anything strange happening twice in the same place were slim. Still, as I got closer to those hills, my grip on the wheel tightened. The GPS voice echoed through the cab, and when it told me to turn onto that same narrow road, I almost ignored it. The forest looked different in daylight, calmer, ordinary. Birds cutting through the branches, wildflowers growing by the ditch. But the moment I passed the spot where I had stopped before, that calm broke. There were tire marks in the gravel, not fresh but clear enough to notice. And further down, a small wooden cross stood at the edge of the ditch. No name, no flowers, just a weathered cross with a strip of red cloth tied around it. The same shade I'd seen in the photo from the news article. I pulled over, stepped out, and walked closer. For a while I just stood there, not sure what I was feeling. Guilt, fear, or something in between. That night I parked my rig behind a rest stop a few miles from town. Couldn't sleep. Around 3 in the morning, a sound woke me. Something faint brushing against the trailer door. It wasn't wind. It came again, soft but deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed down, scanning around the truck. The forest on both sides was still as glass. But then, near the edge of the trees, I caught movement. A figure, slight, crouched, turned away the instant the beam of light hit her. The shape, the hair, the way she moved. It was her. The same woman. I shouted out, but the sound barely carried before she slipped into the trees again, just like before. I didn't report it that time. I sat in my cab till sunrise, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. When daylight finally broke, I checked the ground by the trailer. Small footprints pressed into the dirt, leading back toward the forest. That was the last route I ever ran through that part of Kentucky. Sometimes I still take the interstate nearby, and when I do, I avoid looking toward those hills. But every now and then, if I drive through after dark, I swear I catch a glimpse of someone standing by the trees. Still, quiet, watching, and I never stop anymore. The forest roads around my town are quiet after dark, the kind of quiet that makes every small sound stand out. That night, I rode my motorcycle through one of those narrow dirt paths, headlight cutting through the fog, my breath fogging up the inside of my helmet. My friend Ethan had called me a couple of hours earlier. His dog, a black shepherd mix named Jasper, had bolted into the woods chasing a deer and never came back. He lived a few miles outside town, in one of those old houses surrounded by trees so dense they almost swallowed the light. I told him I'd meet him halfway, thinking we'd just find the dog tangled somewhere or scared under a tree. The air felt heavy that night, colder than usual for early autumn. Every few minutes I passed patches of mist that hung close to the ground, and the beam of my headlight caught flashes of something white. Just fog, I told myself. I kept the engine at a low hum, not wanting to scare Jasper if he was nearby. My phone was mounted on the handlebar, the GPS marking the trail that led toward Ethan's place. Around me, Only the rhythmic growl of the bike and the sound of gravel crunching beneath the tires filled the silence. About 20 minutes in, I slowed down near a bend where the trees pressed close on both sides. There was a faint sound, like a branch cracking somewhere behind me. I figured maybe it was just a deer, but it came again, sharper this time from the same spot. I stopped the bike, turned off the engine, and let the darkness close in around me. The silence after the engine died was so complete it almost rang in my ears. I took off my helmet and listened. For a few seconds, nothing. Then came the sound again. Slow, deliberate steps through dry leaves, moving just beyond the edge of the headlight's reach. I called out Jasper's name, my voice sounding too loud in the still air. No response. I shone my phone flashlight toward the trees, and the light caught on something pale between the branches. Maybe bark, maybe not. Whatever it was, it shifted when I moved the light. I waited, heart thudding in my chest until the silence returned. That was enough for me. I started the bike again and gunned it down the trail toward Ethan's place, refusing to glance back even once. By the time I reached Ethan's driveway, the trees had thinned, and I could finally see the outline of his porch light through the haze. He came out before I even parked, flashlight in hand, his face tense. He said he'd heard barking earlier near the creek behind the house, but it stopped all at once. We decided to split up. He'd search the yard while I checked the tree line where the property ended. The woods looked different there, denser somehow, as if the trunks were standing closer than they should. My flashlight beam moved across them, catching bits of fog that twisted and disappeared in the light. A noise came from deeper inside, the same sharp crack of wood I'd heard before. I froze in place, listening again. This time, it wasn't just one sound. It was several, like something moving slowly, pushing through the brush, careful but massive. I called Ethan's name, but he didn't answer. My instinct screamed at me to move, but curiosity held me there just long enough to hear something breathe. Not panting like a dog, but long, uneven exhales that broke through the silence like someone forcing air through their throat. That's when I saw movement, tall, hunched, shifting just enough for my light to catch the edge of what looked like a shoulder. I backed away, nearly tripping over a root before running back toward the house. When I reached the porch, Ethan was standing there, still scanning the woods. I told him we should get inside, but he was sure it was just a deer. We argued quietly until Jasper's collar jingled somewhere in the dark, followed by a short bark that didn't sound right. Too low, almost strained. Ethan's expression changed. He went down the steps, calling for his dog. I followed with the flashlight, though part of me didn't want to. We walked maybe 30 feet before the barking stopped again. Then everything went silent, except for the wind passing through the trees. We waited there for what felt like forever before heading back to the porch. Ethan locked the door behind us, still insisting it had to be an animal. We sat there for a while, both of us trying to listen for Jasper. I left shortly after, uneasy but pretending to be calm for his sake. The next day he called and said Jasper hadn't come back. He sounded different on the phone, quieter, like he hadn't slept. A few hours later, he sent me a message saying he'd checked his security camera, and there was something he wanted me to see. When I got to his house that evening, he had the footage paused on the living room TV. The camera was angled toward the porch, catching the faint glow from the single bulb above the steps. For a few seconds, it showed nothing but shadows and the edge of the woods in the background. Then something moved, slowly stepping into the light. It was tall enough that the top of its head almost touched the frame of the porch roof. Its shape was wrong, too thin, too long in the arms, as if it had been stretched. It paused under the light, and the moment the brightness touched it, the image flickered like static. When the screen cleared, it was gone. Ethan rewound it 3 times, his hands trembling slightly every time the thing appeared. There was no clear face, just a pale blur where one should be, and the way it stood. It looked aware of the camera, like it had stepped forward on purpose. The strangest part was the sound that followed. The microphone caught faint breathing, but not from the porch. It came from behind the camera inside the house. The recording ended abruptly when the porch light went out. I remember Ethan staring at the screen, his mouth slightly open, whispering that the light bulb had burnt out that same night. We went outside to check the porch anyway, even though every part of me wanted to leave. The bulb was intact, just unscrewed halfway, hanging loose in its socket. The woods beyond the yard were completely dark, no sound, no crickets, no wind, just that thick, unnatural stillness again. We didn't say much after that. I helped him screw the light back in, and when it flicked on, I could swear I saw something pale shift between the trees before disappearing into the dark again. A week later, Ethan moved out. He never told anyone where he went. The house is still there, but people in town say the light on the porch sometimes turns on by itself, even though no one's lived there for months. I have not gone back down that road since that night, but sometimes when I ride through the countryside after dark, I catch myself glancing at the tree line. Every time I do, I feel like something out there is already watching,